And you are live.
Welcome back to the Income-Based Education Tax Study Committee. It is still October 26th and sometime around 1:15. And we're gonna we're restarting, but before we hear from our first witness on the agenda, just wondering if anyone had any lunchtime thoughts. Yes.
I think we should call it the I Bet Committee.
Thank you. That was a very valuable lunchtime thought.
Because it's too long. And that's my suggestion.
Really appreciate that.
I wouldn't.
Any other thoughts from anyone?
This is what happens when you put so much information into your brain.
I know.
It starts
I
to
know,
get tilt.
I know.
Usually it's 5 o'clock before this happens.
Yes. I don't even actually think about what the committee is called. I just read it off the agenda and then it completely falls out of my mind again. The things that I have in the parking lot so far are the administration of the taxes. You know, how do we actually do this? Is it a withholding on an income tax form? Is it a bill that's based on income that gets sent? What happens? Cash flow to the districts. Again, solvable problem, but needs to be figured out. Are we taxing on next year or last year or this year? And renters, including sort of a subsidy versus a rebate in our existing system. The circuit breaker, both the town levels, the town tax circuit breaker, as well as the circuit breaker on education taxes. Town one comes out of the general fund. So if we are changing that, we need to be mindful of that. Homestead, house site definitions, as well as non-homestead tax as a lever. And then sort of related to that first thing is definitions of income. And how we define income, which is sort of frustratingly complex too. And then I just added sales tax on services to this list here, but I think I'm just going to sort of expand that to other taxes. Make it a little less specific. And I managed to just perfectly bide our time until Steph walked in. Hello, welcome. Yeah.
You add onto there the question of where you apply, where and when you apply the local decisions that what do we call that? Well, no, I mean, we've talked about, do you keep just a small property tax and in addition to the income or whatever, and then one of them, at least one of them has to be, probably both have to be applied against local rates, right? So you wouldn't presumably ask employers to figure out which town.
So when and how local rates are adjusted?
Yeah.
Okay.
If you're going to do a withholding.
Okay, great.
When do you apply, where and when?
Okay.
And Emily, are we going to hear about the current renter rebate or should I learn that on my own?
I think we could hear about it because I need to learn it on my own and it seems like.
Yeah, I think it'd be.
I think we all need to learn it.
The tax department's proposal, so I think it would be good to have them
Yeah, okay, great.
come in.
With that, Ms. Yu, would you like to join us?
I hope it's okay if I have my computer open. I haven't done this in person in a long time.
You absolutely can have your camera. Did you send us slides though?
I didn't.
Okay, great.
Slides too.
That means that we didn't lose your slides. So this is an ideal world for it now.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. Last time, I think I was my hotel room in Cleveland. I am Stephanie Yu, the Deputy Director of Public Access Institute, which I know you've heard from us and me before. So I just wanted to kind of, there's a couple things I wanted to I guess, explain in a little bit more depth than the last time I was here and just kind of think through. I know you've covered a lot of ground since the last time I was here, so, and are looking at any number of options. So I just kind of want to sort of reset what we're thinking about this and also just kind of, introduce some ideas that maybe you have been thinking about, but maybe haven't been central in the discussion, or, just sort of our thoughts that we hope would be helpful to the conversations. So I know it's a really complicated conversation, and I've spent some time kind of reflecting on why public assets, long before I was here, public assets has been advocating for income-based taxes, and some of you too. And so I really wanted to sort of think about, refresh our thinking about why we say this, why we believe this. And it comes down to these sort of three main goals, some of which you've heard before, but again, I just kind of want to give a little more depth to them. The first is making the system simpler. The second is making the system fairer. And the third, which maybe we haven't said in quite this way before, is to preserve and strengthen the link between local spending decisions, that vote you make on town meeting day, and how much you pay in school taxes. So I wanted to just kind of explain each of these a little bit more with a little bit more context. And then, always happy to take questions, think out loud, whatever you all are looking for. But on the first one, the making the system simpler. When we're talking about this, we're really talking about simpler from the perspective of the voter, the taxpayer, not the administrators. The Tax Structure Commission did a lot of great work on this, dug into a lot of these questions. And I think they cited really two primary messages that they heard from all of that testimony that they took. That one, the strength of Vermont's current school funding system is its equity. And second, the weakness is its complexity. The complexity is the main problem. So to address this problem of complexity, the commission recommended eliminating the current hybrid system where you're choosing between the property-based tax and the income-based rate, and using only the income-based rate that would continue to be determined by local budget decisions. Again, I think there's a lot of technical details that might remain complex from the administration and implementation perspective, but this system would be much simpler for voters. I know your discussions have sort of ranged all over in terms of one system, two systems, some adjustments to the current sort of hybrid system, but I think that the idea of going to one system is really has a big impact on the simplicity of the system and the understanding of the voters. So, and again, I think a lot of those technical challenges that you've been talking about apply to both the current system and the new system. So you're not sort of losing ground, and hopefully you're gaining ground in terms of the simplicity. So for example, how predictable the tax base is. If you decide to use last year's income, which is known, and apply the current year's rate, it can be entirely predictable. Or things like when the yield is set. Again, working out all of those questions is the job of the tax department, or in the case of the yield, the legislature, and they're all sort of fixable, they're all surmountable. But it's really about what you decide you want to achieve with these changes, and then the implementation follows. So I think what's critical here is that the system be made simpler for voters. They'll know what their school taxes will be, a lot closer at least, on when they vote on their school budgets. The second piece is making the system fairer. So from our perspective, and again, I think the definition of fairness might not be the same for everybody, so I think we want to be really explicit about what we mean by fair. From our perspective, it really means making the current regressive system more progressive, moving in a progressive direction. Preferably progressive or at least flat. We recognize that, so what we mean by that, taxes should be based on ability to pay, and those with more should pay a higher percentage of their income. Again, I know your focus is school tax here, but we're also thinking about how the whole tax system interacts with people. So ITEP, which is the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, some of you may be familiar with their report, Who Pays, which is an incredibly useful report on who pays what in state and local taxes across the US. There's a lot of great individual state-by-state information, but I think what's also helpful is that it sort of gives you the whole context across the country of what the types of systems are and sort of the range of how they interact. And there will be an updated report out in January, so we'll be sure to share that when it comes out, and that'll have sort of more current, the last one was in 2018. But I think what it tells us is that most states have a mix of these sort of big three, right? The income taxes, the sales taxes, and the property taxes. And we know that sales taxes tend to be very regressive since everyone has to buy a certain amount of stuff, but it's a larger share of smaller incomes. Property taxes also tend to be regressive, again, because as the Tax Structure Commission showed very effectively, property tends to be a smaller share of your total assets the wealthier you are. And as you've been talking about, renters tend to be low income and are paying their landlord's property taxes through higher rent. And income taxes can be progressive, like in Vermont. Many states have this explicitly progressive system where the rates go up as your income goes up. But other states have a flat rate or no income tax. And so those states with either a flat tax or no income tax at all have the most regressive systems, state and local systems combined. So overall, they're not countering the regressivity of the sales and the property tax through an income tax like Vermont does to some extent. So we do have one of the least regressive state tax systems state and local, when you look at it combined, although it's still not entirely progressive. It's relatively flat. And a lot of that is due to the fact that we have this progressive personal income tax. But another way of thinking about this, and as ITEP sort of frames, I think pretty well, is that whether a tax system is progressive or regressive is another way of asking whether that system overall is increasing or decreasing income inequality. So it's not just about who has the money to pay, but it's also about what's driving that income distribution in the first place, right? So how do we end up with low income, high income, middle income, and how are those, and if in fact income inequality, which we know to be true, is increasing, then what are we doing about that through our state and local tax systems? So again, just to reiterate, we believe that the goal is to make the system more progressive so that school taxes as a part of the system are contributing to the overall progressivity of the state tax system and not making it more regressive. So the third goal, again, is about the strengthening of the relationship between our votes, your vote on your school budget, and what you pay in school taxes. So I don't want to lose sight of the fact that we have this very unique and complex system, both to establish fairness in how we're paying for education and to ensure that communities get to decide for themselves what their school budgets will be. So this income-based approach, we think, would better connect voters to their budget decisions because they have a much better sense of what their tax bills would be before town meeting day or whenever they vote their budgets. So I know that you're considering a number of different options for changes to the system, but from our perspective, that link between tax rates and local spending decisions is really the cornerstone of this whole system. And any option that either breaks or erodes that link would do serious harm to the relationship between communities. So I know you I kind of ran over here, so hopefully I don't sound too out of breath, but I know you've got a lot of decisions to make, a lot to think about, but I think, these are the goals as we define them. I'm sure you have defining your goals as a piece of this, and I may have said something similar a month ago, but I think figuring out what the goals are first is what matters, and then the implementation follows. That is the job of the tax department to implement the decisions that you make. So rather than letting the complications of that implementation overwhelm what are worthwhile goals of changes. So again, from our perspective, those goals should be making the system simpler for taxpayers, making the system fairer, by which we mean more progressive overall, and contributing to the overall what we would hope would be the overall progressivity of the whole state and local tax system, and strengthening that link between the local spending decisions and the resulting school tax rates.
Peter.
Thanks, Stephanie. The first goal you talked about was making it simpler, and you said a couple of times when people go to vote on their school budget, they'll have a better sense of their taxes. I have a little trouble with that just logistically. So for example, if we had an income-based education tax right now, town meeting day, I would be going to the polls to vote on my FY24 school budget. If I'm waiting till April 15th to pay my taxes, I'll be paying my taxes after that vote, perhaps even not even having calculated them yet. But really my taxes I'm looking at that point are calendar year 22. So I guess I'm not really sure you'd have a very good idea of what your taxes would be or what the impact of the budget you're voting on is on your own personal income taxes.
Well, I don't know if everyone waits until April 15th to file their taxes, but fair enough. I think that, so a couple of things I'd say to that. One is that I think it clears up a lot of the confusion on whether or not the property choice is the better choice for you or the income rate choice is the best for you. The common level of appraisal, there's a lot of confusion that gets cleared up. It doesn't mean you're going to have the exact dollar amount, of your taxes. It doesn't mean that you even know your income down to the dollar. I don't know that anybody really sort of carries that number necessarily around, but you have a much better ballpark of where it would be. And there's many fewer calculations that you have to do. There's much less information that you would have to get closer to that. And I think, part of this is also about the yield question and the timing of the yield. So whether or not the yield is a known thing before town meeting day is part of the question here. It can be, it hasn't been, but it could be. And I think, but oftentimes, but even if you don't set the yield until later in the legislative session, you still have the December 1 letter, you have some sense, you have a pretty good sense. It doesn't go that far afield from where the predictions are generally. So I think you still have just much more information than you have under the current hybrid system. I agree with you, it's not down to the penny.
And we do, even though we don't vote the yield until after town meeting and after the elections and all of that, we do tend to do a lot of like public signaling of where we think the yield might be before town meeting. Like we really go out of our way in Ways and Means to do that, so that there is more information for voters. But I don't know if anyone who's not on Ways and Means knows that happens.
Yeah.
I mean, I think like reporters know, but I don't know if all of you actually knew that.
Or even if they
Oh, I
know it.
think school boards are very clear
Yes.
and are generally highly accurate in predicting what property tax impacts will be and the income rate as well.
And I think the confusion for me as a voter has always been like, I don't know which of those two rates is going to be the rate that I'll be paying. And that's where I get into the confusion.
And if I could, I mean, I think a lot of people are in the position where they're paying some of each. So there's additional calculations that they have to make to figure that out.
And my experience is that people really just look at the property tax anyway, because that's a gauge that they can understand and a gauge they use to say, my school district is spending too much or spending too little.
Right, even if it doesn't necessarily translate exactly into their tax bill. Right?
Exactly.
Do you, Steph, or others have information that we know how people are making these decisions? Because my just anecdotal experience is that people don't try to calculate it actually, that they just look at the budget and they say like, what's the percent increase? Is that too much? More than try to figure out how it impacts them. So that's my gut feeling, but I don't know if there any studies have been done to try to figure out how people.
We've tried for years by putting things on the ballot, like
Right.
this is what the average per pupil spending is. This is we're still trying. So I don't think the idea, I guess, has been to have people vote down their school budgets if they're going up, and it doesn't seem to work overall. I don't think that. I think people do. They look at it and they, if you've got kids in school, you're saying, well, what works for them? And if you don't, you say, what works for what seems reasonable?
I'll just answer. I don't think that there are studies necessarily that have been done sort of that, or surveys that I guess it would be a survey of like what people are thinking. I think you're right in the sense that there's probably a core group of people, maybe a lot of them parents, who will approve, and there's a core group of people who might not approve, and neither of them are necessarily like a little difference in the rate here or there is going to drive that decision, right? But I do wonder, part of what I think to be true, and I, some of you may have a better sense of what happened after the implementation of Act 60 and 68, since I wasn't here at the time. But I do think that part of the reason that people aren't trying to do that calculation is because of the complexity and because of the sense that the tax rate does some crazy thing no matter what I decide. So if that frustration is sort of divorcing them from using that to factor into their decision making, and I think taking a step backward too, I think it's also influencing how school boards develop their budgets and decide what they're going to ask of the community, because recognizing that the tolerance in the community might be lower because of the frustration. So I think that eliminating a lot of that complexity or the confusion for voters would go a long way toward resetting how people think about it. It might take a while. I mean, I think it probably took a generation after Act 60 to sort of feel like maybe we had gotten to a fairer place and we could trust it a little bit more, as opposed to still being in that phase of feeling that property taxes are really out of control and we're really frustrated with it. So, I think a lot of this is the human nature question of of your policy decisions, which is tough to predict.
If you had to choose between making it more equitable and making it simpler, which would you choose?
I think it's equitable, but I also think, again, I think this is the outward facing simplicity and the external and the behind the scenes simplicity are two very different questions. I think if it's equitable, if it sounds equitable to people, that makes them feel like it's simpler. So I think they're actually connected. And I think, again, sort of, I don't always know what goes into sort of those backroom decisions about what I calculate as part of my adjusted gross income and what I don't calculate as part of my, sort of what all those back calculations are, if you have to fill out Schedule A or Schedule B or whatever it is on your, it's not that you necessarily understand all that, but you trust that the numbers are the right numbers or the numbers they want you to calculate, right? I don't know. Part of it is trust in the system, I think.
Thanks. Yeah.
Stephanie,
I'll be right.
I think the political elephant in the room is, and we haven't even talked about it today, I don't think it's been mentioned, is what happens if you do this, flat education income tax, or maybe even a progressive income tax, and it impacts the residency decisions of the 2% of the people in the state that pay 36% of the income taxes to the general fund. How worried are you about that dynamic?
I think, again, I think there has been a lot of work done on tax flight and really sort of putting that to bed. I think there's always going to be some people who make decisions based on those things. I think they're a very small share, and I think overall they're not sort of changing the critical mass of what the policy change achieves. So in other words, if you were to raise the top marginal income tax rate by a couple of percentage points, right? Some people might get frustrated and leave, but the whole group, as a whole, you're going to raise more money from that group. So even if you lose a couple of people around the edges, the overall revenue that you're going to get from that increase is going to go up. So I think it's sort of like, again, I think the political problem is a different problem in terms of a lot of this is perception. And so I think that does make a difference, but from a sort of mathematical perspective, you don't raise taxes and get less revenue. Like not enough people leave that it makes such a difference that it negates the effect of the change, right?
Yeah, just building on that. I mean, New York passed a millionaire surcharge recently. Maybe Connecticut, I feel like California. Anyway,
On the ballot in Massachusetts.
it's on the ballot. That's right. So are you aware of data that can help us, feel confident that this is more or less debunked or, maybe it's not a fair question on the spot, but.
No, there are a ton of studies on it, and actually, we can share some recent studies. There's been a good Stanford study on it. I mean, I think that, and what they come down to is that the reasons that where people choose where to live are complicated and sort of many rooted, right? So that it's not just one little tax piece that's going to drive a decision to move away, especially like if you're a business owner here and you have a lot of these ties and a lot of your income is derived from having a business here. It's not so easy to just pick up and move, and it's just not something that happens very frequently. Or, there might be the occasional, but it just doesn't happen that much. So we can definitely provide studies on that front. But I think, and this is something we maybe talked about the last time I was here, which is, worry that we haven't seen tax flight yet, but there might be a point at which we would start to see it, and that's what we're worried about. And I think just sort of looking, and I do rely a lot on that Who Pays report. I think it's really helpful. And so just looking at it, when you look at the total impact, so at the low end, it's 8 to 9% total that you're paying in state of your income that you're paying in state, so in local. At the top, it's 10.4, 10.5. Like there's not a huge spread. Some states have a much bigger spread, right? And that top effective rate can be a lot higher depending on how they break it out. Again, marginal income tax rates, we know that there are a handful of states that have higher top marginal rates, but also where that top marginal rate kicks in makes a big difference. So I don't think people, similar to this question are you really deciding whether to vote yes on the school budget based on 0.1 or 0.2%? I think it's a similar argument that you're not really deciding it on that small marginal difference and that we're nowhere near the ballpark of like taking so much of somebody's money that that's it, right? Like, I just don't think we're in the ballpark of that conversation. But I'm happy to share links to the studies that have, a lot of the good studies that have been done, especially some of the more recent ones on.
That'd be great.
on tax levy.
I've seen studies, I've seen a bunch of studies that say people don't move their residence because of that or move out of state because of that, and more about people have a higher incentive to hide more of their income.
The problem on the
All over the-
personal income tax,
Yes, very much so, yes.
it's not a problem of enforcing school taxes, it's a problem of tax enforcement more generally.
Yes.
So I just, I don't, you can solve that problem generally, or you can recognize that there's going to be some of that. But it's going to happen across all the different taxes.
Anyone else?
Sure. Do you have, you've thought about this a lot, it seems like. Do you have thoughts on, should we just look at AGI, or should we maintain what is used today to calculate the household income, things like the tax base? Yep.
Yeah, I think that the Tax Structure Commission looked at this. I know you all have asked that question. I think that part of the complexity from the tax department's perspective too is that the household income definition used for school taxes is like no other, right? It's its own thing. It doesn't connect to any of your other sort of definitions of income. So I think moving to AGI makes the most sense. I mean, I think there's been some questions raised around, and part of this is what defines a household is messy, especially when you get into renters and roommates and that kind of stuff. It's relatively straightforward if your household is a married filing jointly, whatever, but it's more complicated when there are lots of different households take lots of different configurations. So I think AGI makes the most sense. I think there was some of the question was around how do you adjust for household size, adjusted gross income does that, you're getting to some of that with that. So I think that's the best option to us.
Great.
And the renters?
And the renters.
Ideas on the renters?
So I know this is sort of a thorny question. I think I'd probably reiterate the high level stuff, and I think we'd be happy to kind of get into more technical details, but I don't want to speak off the cuff on a lot of these technical details. But I think the main goal is making sure that renters aren't double paying. Tax Structure Commission, again, I think had some good thoughts on this. The key is not to make sure that they're not double paying. So to create a system where, I think that the goal of this, again, why we believe in income-based school taxes is that we want the paying for school to be tied to income. So we want that to be true for everybody, whether you're a renter or a homeowner. We want that. So we're starting with that premise, that this is a system based on income. But then we recognize that renters are double paying, so we need to do something to correct for that. So whatever the mechanism, I think there's a number of different mechanisms where you can do that. And the hope would be, since renters tend to be lower income and lower wealth, that we would want to make sure that that the cash is staying in their hands as much as possible, so that they're not double paying at any point, and that if we can have sort of if the true up can be more than annually or whatever that might look like, it's making sure that the money stays in their pockets. And I know you all have thought about sort of the fact that, again, this isn't a problem that's particular to school taxes. It's a little bit quirky in the school tax sense because they're paying their landlord's property taxes. But a lot of the sort of, the problem with rent being unaffordable for renters is a bigger problem than just school taxes. So, and it varies from market to market in terms of how much school taxes are sort of pushing up the rent or a factor in the rent versus other things.
Thank you.
Tricky one.
Well, thank you very much for sort of recenter. I feel like the last few hours has been like recentering on the problem at hand, and I appreciate you joining us for that.
Do it, and I'm happy to send follow-ups or answer any other questions if I can be helpful.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So at our last meeting, we asked JFO to sort of play is the wrong word, to examine ideas around sort of levers we could pull within the existing system that might achieve what we wanted to achieve. And so I think Graham is going to be the one who talks to us about that.
He has appeared.
He did.
Indeed. Thank you, Madam Chair. Graham Campbell from the Joint Fiscal Office. As was said, this presentation is going to run through some modeling done by Deb Brighton that attempts to adjust the property tax credit in a way that the committee, in order to achieve a certain stated objectives of the committee last meeting, to try to make the effective tax rate distribution for the net property tax paid a flatter or more progressive slope. So before I dig in, I'll just say that these are, when we talked to Deb about doing this, we gave her sort of broad parameters that the goals were to make the effective tax rate distribution more progressive, to smooth out kinks. And these were ideas that she came up with. And this is not necessarily anything that the committee has to take up, but I think at the end of this presentation, I'll present sort of two broad conclusions about this modeling exercise that would apply to any sort of changes or adjustments to the property tax credit to achieve kind of what the committee was talking about last meeting that I think apply to any modeling exercise for the property tax credit. So there's a presentation on the committee's webpage. It's called Adjusting the Property Tax Credit Modeling Considerations. And I'm moving to sort of the first slide here beyond the title slide. So before we begin, I'll note that this was done by Deb Brighton using data from 2019 incomes. So it's not exactly the most current data set, but we thought it was still fine because what we're going for here is not necessarily exact numbers, but we're going for more broader concepts about how you could achieve various outcomes with various proposals and what type of impacts we see. Like I said, the results of the modeling should be used as approximate, not exact. So when I'm talking about figures here about sort of the potential cost, don't take that to the bank. Just know that's the approximate level of cost it would be to achieve the goal, the sort of stated goal. And as I said here, the scenarios that are modeled here are based upon the guidance of the committee from the October 12th meeting. So what we took away from that meeting was three sort of objectives. First was smoothing the relatively high effective tax rates for upper middle income taxpayers. So this is sort of what Deb and I refer to as the plus 90K bulge. So after you get over the $90,000 limit, you have sort of the sort of over 138,000 to about 175,000 that have this bulge where their effective tax rates are higher. The second is to lift the effective tax rates for very high income taxpayers. So that was something that the committee pointed out on October 12th, was that, and as I presented, that very high income taxpayers, those over $250,000, $300,000 in adjusted gross income, were paying relatively low effective tax rates for just the property tax. And the final one was to try to prevent low and middle income taxpayers from seeing their effective tax rates rise. So we're essentially, we have this curve and we're kind of pushing down on one end, trying to make one end go up and keep the sort of bottom end the same. Before we dive in, I just want to say that the general, even though the data is a little old here, the general conclusions from this exercise, I think, apply up across multiple sets of income thresholds or house site values. So you may look at sort of the numbers that Deb chose here and say, well, what if we did it at, instead of 400,000, 375? What I'm trying to communicate here is that the sort of general pattern of the results are what you should be looking at here, not, well, you just happen to pick a number that is too high or too low for the committee. So think about this as general directions. Again, before I get into this, I'm moving to the next slide. I want to explain, you're going to be seeing a lot of charts in this presentation. And I want to explain kind of what you're looking at. So on slide 3, you'll see the effective tax rate curve. That's the purple line here. So you can see that the lowest group is paying about 1.5% of their income as a share, or their net property taxes are about 1.5% of their total income. And then the highest group is the 125 to 140,000 group, and they're paying close or just over 3% of their income in net property taxes. And then it sort of dives off at the end. This is very similar to the charts that I presented in October 12th. Oh, this is 2019 data, so just keep that in mind. This is very similar to the chart that I think Public Assets Group presented to the committee in earlier meeting. So these charts that essentially I direct the committee's attention to the purple line. What we're trying to do is make this purple line a more smoother upward shaped curve rather than sort of this slow upslope, a bulge, and then a dip. The dark blue bars indicate the total property tax paid after the property tax credit. So no net property taxes paid. And this is broken out into what is called ventiles. Ventiles means there are 20 groups here, and each group has the same number of taxpayers in it. So you can think of it as 5% of the total taxpayer population is sitting within each group. So if you look at the farthest group on the right of this chart, the over $233,000 group, that means that that group is the top 5% of taxpayers. And then if you sort of start moving left, then you're saying the top 10% of taxpayers, the top 15% of taxpayers. So each group has 5% of taxpayers in it. Does everyone understand sort of the concept here? The reason we went with ventiles is because I know Representative Kornheiser asked to look at quintiles or quartiles. I think looking at just quintiles or quartiles would have missed some of the nuance and the effect on each taxpayer group. So by doing it into ventiles, we can more clearly see the impacts on each group.
And Graham, if this was individual, if this was AGI instead of household income, would the curves be pretty similar?
So my understanding is that this is a database that includes household income for people who file the property tax credit, and for people who don't file for a property tax credit, it is matched to their adjusted gross income. So this is the entire universe of taxpayers. So I think obviously there's a difference between household income and adjusted gross income, but for a large number of people in this database, about 30% of the taxpayers who don't actually get a property tax credit, we are using their AGI here. Okay. And then for those who do receive the credit, it's household income, which may be similar, but it is very likely different. But it's probably a pretty good approximation.
And I'm not saying, is it the same sort of groups of people? I'm saying, like, would the dynamic, you said these dynamics apply in multiple scenarios. I'm wondering if these dynamics you think would apply in that scenario.
I do. I think if you switch this all to AGI, I think they would apply. Okay,
thank you. Chris?
Graham, I want to test my own understanding. In the middle of this chart here is a very flat line between 50 and 87,000. All of those what do you call them, twin ventiles. And I believe that's because income sensitivity is doing its work, but we know there are people that are eligible for income sensitivity but don't use it. It's cheaper to pay on the property value. So is that reflected in this chart because they're paying effectively the same amount based on property, or is it reflected in this chart because this is an average of everyone in that ventile?
I would think of this not as an average of everyone in that ventile. It's take everyone in that ventile and each individual household, total up what their net property tax is. So whether they paid totally on property or whether they received a property tax credit, and add up all that income or add up all that tax paid and divide it by their income. And so for some people in that ventile, they will be paying only on property, just depending upon what their house site is. for a lot of people, they'll be receiving a property tax credit. The ventile here, sort of the, roughly 2.5% that you see in this middle group, that's essentially the total aggregate of summing up all those individuals, how much tax they paid, regardless of whether it's fully on property or whether they're receiving a very large property tax credit, and then divides it by their total income. So that's what that's showing. So within that group, as you're saying, and I think there's people who will be paying solely upon property because it's advantageous to do so. And then there's probably a lot of them who are receiving a property tax credit.
Okay, thanks.
So, where was I here? So the next slide is basically the current situation. I'm going to sort of set the table before we start tweaking with the system. Right now, about 70%, based upon this data, of taxpayers are receiving a property tax credit. We know that number is a little bit lower. Currently, it's about 67, 68%. I think was it Julia last told me, but this is still, again, based on FY 2019. So in this data set, 70% of taxpayers get a credit. And we have three quote unquote problem areas. The first is sort of going from left to right on this chart in terms of the red circles. The first is we have these cliffs and bumps for lower income people around the circuit breaker. So you can see for people from $18,000 to $25,000, there's a steep jump up after that to the 25 to 32, and then a steep jump up to 47. And that's basically reflective of the circuit breaker because the circuit breaker has different tiers for different household income groups. So you have this sort of choppiness at the beginning because of the circuit breaker. The second sort of problem area is the hump after $90,000. This is the old tube young professionals in Burlington, where the property tax credit basically not ends for people after 90,000, but they only get it on the first $225,000 of house site. And so their property tax credits are significantly smaller, and they're gone by about $138,000 in income. So you see this bulge happening, after 90, but particularly after 138, where they're receiving no property tax credit at all. But their house site values are sort of still in, I don't know what the word I want to use, but like normal range. You're not talking very, very high income, very large houses here. And then the third is the highest income taxpayers pay a very low effective tax rate. This is the third circle here. So the highest ventile, top 5% of taxpayers are only paying about 1.3% of their income in property taxes net, whereas the average is closer to 2.5%. So we have those three areas under current law. Again, this is 2019. The curve's slightly different for current year, but generally it's roughly the same situation. I wanted to show a chart here which lays out the percentage of total education taxes paid by each ventile. So the way to interpret this is the $233,000+ ventile is paying about 15% of total education property taxes in this year. So while the effective tax rate curve is not progressive per se, the sort of distribution of taxes paid is, because the highest income groups are paying a higher share of the tax burden. So,
I mean,
Yeah. That's in actual dollars,
yeah.
yes,
not as a percentage of income, but in actual dollars, they are paying more.
that's correct. Yes.
Okay.
If we had this chart for the income tax, it would be the same shape, but the scale would be wildly different, right?
It's the same shape, but the scale, yeah, you're right. So, and I would say that it's more steep here. So the very highest ventile pays a very large percentage of the total income taxes paid.
Yeah, I just want to caution because this would look like a success. and I'm not sure that's entirely right.
Graham, just a question on this graph where it says net education tax paid as a share of total taxes paid. Is it total education taxes paid or?
Yes, yes.
Okay, all right, got it.
Sorry. The title could be a little bit clearer, but yeah, this is the share of total education taxes paid by each ventile.
Okay, so that top ventile is paying 15% of the property tax that goes into the ed
Of
fund,
the homestead.
The
the
homestead,
homestead.
right,
Yeah,
yeah, that's correct.
okay. And
Okay.
if I'm remembering, is it the top two ventiles pay 50% of the income tax revenue? I know there's a small number that pays 50% of,
It probably is.
yeah, of the actual dollars.
Yeah, I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but I could tell you that this chart is much more heavily skewed towards the highest ventiles for the income tax.
Okay.
I just don't want to get the committee confused. Or I want to clarify to the committee that even though the effective tax rates will show that, higher, particularly the highest ventile, pay a relatively low effective tax rate, that's a different thing than saying how much, what share of education taxes are they paying? They are paying I don't want to, disproportionate's not the wrong word, but the top 5% of people in the income distribution are paying about 15% of the total education taxes for the homestead.
Homestead tax, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's sort of setting the table here, current law, what the sort of facts are, the current income distribution and the effective tax rates and share of taxes paid. Now we're going to start going into what Deb has modeled for us. And I'm going to sort of talk about these in not isolation, but we're going to address each one of those three problems in sort of one at a time rather in a sequential way. So we're not stacking each idea on top of each other just yet, because I wanted the committee to see the effect of each individual change. So the first problem that we asked Deb to look at was smoothing the lower income bumps and cliffs up into the circuit breaker. So what Deb designed was not a circuit breaker, but what she is calling, what I'm also calling, is a ramp. So basically the way this works is you have a taxpayer's liability is reduced by a credit by a certain percentage as income rises. So they would, under this scenario, a taxpayer receives a property tax credit, a file, for the credit based upon their house site and their income. But then we say, okay, well, if your income is, say, only $10,000, you're only responsible for paying 20% of the total tax liability. If it's up to, and then we pushed it all the way up to 65 and said at 65%, you're responsible for 100% of that liability. And the reason why Deb designed it that way was because if you simply just push the circuit breaker income limits up to, say, 65 or 60,000, you would be putting a further distance between individuals who are on the circuit, or households that are on the circuit breaker, from their locally voted school budget. So the idea here is, rather than just simply pushing the income limits from the circuit breaker up, we would make this sort of ramp effect where you have this obligation, quote unquote, that's dependent upon income. So it ties these people still to their school budgets. Is that clear how I've explained that? So the effect of this is you get this nice smooth curve at the bottom for people under 65. That's the green circle in this chart. And that gets dumped onto primarily the higher income people who are, or not high, I shouldn't say higher, the 90,000 bulge and the highest ventile. And the total cost of this in 2019 under that data set would be about $14 million to do that ramp up. So this goes back to what I said on October 12th is, this is a pretty big change in the property tax system. But I think the scale of what we were talking about with respect to making people pay an income tax in terms of the dollar figures is relatively small.
Graham, so if we made this change and it cost $14 million, am I right that say it would only be like a third of that $14 million that would be carried by the homestead tax? And so it's an additional 4+ million that causes that bump in the 80 to 170 range.
So generally, when the legislature sets the yields, right, they're trying to make the average bill change under the homestead and non-homestead stay the same. So
Yes.
if you were to make, as you say there, I think this change, at least the way Deb modeled it, is it would be paid for primarily, if not all of it, by homestead taxpayers, not by the non-homestead. But you could imagine a world where the legislature sets the yield such that non-homestead picks up a proportionate or disproportionate share.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Thanks.
So that's a sort of solving problem one.
Wait, 1 second.
Greg, just so I keep flipping back between your two charts here, but the folks circled in red, has that changed? That's changed just enough to raise 14 new million, is that right?
No, so the way Deb in this chart, so Deb has not folded that cost into the chart yet.
So that's all the same. The only change here between this and 2 pages earlier is the green.
Is the green, exactly. And so we know that this would cost 14 million, but I'm sort of saying, in theory, this is going to be dumped onto those groups in the red circle, just because you would have to set the yield lower in order to pay for this. And
Also, it would also, sorry.
You could set the income deal lower too. I mean,
Yeah, that's what was confusing me. Okay, thank you.
So that's sort of solving problem one, smoothing those low income bumps. The next problem that I think the committee was pretty strongly focused on in the October 12th meeting was the upper middle bump, the people over 90,000, and particularly the people over $138,000 who had that sort of hump. And the idea, what Deb proposed here was, right now for people who are over $90,000 income, the maximum house site that make them eligible for a property tax credit is 225. So they only receive property tax credit on the first 225 of house site value. What Deb has modeled here is that everyone would get $400,000 for house site value. So under current law, because the maximum house site value is 225 for people over 90,000, the math is such that the maximum income for a property tax credit under the current system is about $138,000. Deb, by making this house site cap $400,000, means that the income phase out goes all the way up to, I think she said, over $300,000 is people who would be getting credit. So this is the solution, or a solution, for solving this middle income cap. And you can see the green circle basically pushes that curve down by making this $400,000 house site for everyone. About 10% more households would get more credit. So 80% of households. And just doing this would cost $37 million to pull this off. And so again, in this chart, you don't see the sort of smoothed out lower income bumps because we're not going sequentially here. But B, that 37 million is not dumped into this chart yet. But it's assumed that you would have to be picked up by either the homestead, the non-homestead, or the income yield in some way, shape, or form, or some combination thereof.
But if we do all of these, we've got the 37 plus the 14, right?
Right. So we're getting there. Well, so yeah, you're totaling up these costs. That's what it would sort of cost adding these two things up. Yeah.
Okay.
So solving the third problem is the committee expressed a desire to try to make the highest taxpayers with the highest incomes pay a greater share of their income in property taxes. And the way that Deb tried to go about this, and I'll elaborate on this a little bit more, was that more or less what she did here was she created a situation where the yield was set almost artificially low. And the idea was just to make the tax rate really high, such that these people who don't receive property taxes would end up paying such high property taxes, their effective tax rates would go up to about 2.6%. Is everyone following how that was what I'm talking about here? So she's not essentially specifically saying for this group, you have to pay more. She's just saying, you know what, set the yield in a way that these people end up paying about 2.6% in their income.
What happens to the hump we just smoothed out?
So this iteration does not include sort of the smoothed out hump. So we're just looking at each individual one right now, and then I'll combine them all and I'll show you what it looks like, how it works.
It's very hard to wait, Graham. I think that you organize this in the right way, and we're all like
It's
chomping
like
at the bit
Christmas
here.
morning, it's time to open the presents.
Big reveal.
I'm not asking you to rush though.
No, I went back and forth on this. Well, do I just present them all smashed together, but I think it's instructive to show,
Yep.
at least for the overall conclusions, why I'm sort of going individually.
I agree.
Thing. So what happens here is you manage to push the high income people up to 2.6% of income. But this is sort of leading into one of the conclusions that I'm going to present in a couple slides, is that by doing this, what you do is you create just a whole bunch of funkiness in the system because you're pushing up the rates for everyone. And so now a lot of the lower income people, particularly the people on the circuit breaker, are going to be receiving humongous property tax credits in order to shield them from this very low yield. And so this is what happens. I should pause here and say, but those right now in current law, there's a cap on the maximum property tax credit of $5,600. So what happens is because of this really high yield, people at the lower ends, because of the maximum credit, end up paying a much higher share of their income because there is only a maximum credit that they can receive. So that's what this chart on the right is showing, is that while we've pushed up the group in the red circle, because of the maximum credit, the people at the lower end, even after they receive the maximum credit, still end up paying a lot more in property taxes than they were before.
Graham, did
Yes.
you look at how many under 90,000 that currently aren't using the property tax credit would suddenly fall into using the property tax credit?
I did not. No, I don't have an answer to that question, although I can
All right.
see if Deb can help us out on that one.
Okay, thank you.
And Graham, do you know how many now hit the cap that are under 90? Like what's
I
the
don't
difference?
know how many people currently hit the cap. I'll get an answer then.
And inflation could impact that, right? Inflation in the housing prices.
Yeah.
Well, it's a credit cap though, right? Not a
It's a dollar
house
cap.
value
It's a
cap.
dollar
It's
cap.
a dollar
Yeah.
cap.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So moving on to slide 9, this is where we start building stuff a little bit. So we've solved sort of problem 3, which is making higher effective tax rates for high income people. But we created this new problem, which is low income people now are paying a bunch more in property taxes because of the maximum credit. So what we had to do next was turn another dial, which was, well, let's just make the maximum credit $10,000 here. So first we set a yield so that high income people pay more as a share of their income. And then we change the max credit to $10,000. And then we get back to sort of the curve that we're used to. But the problem with this is that the cost of that $10,000 cap gets borne, or would be borne in theory, by middle income taxpayers. So essentially you're forcing that part of the curve down. And in this case, Deb has modeled what the effect would be. So you're talking about $130 million in tax increase, of which 80 million would be borne by sort of the $90,000 hump group here. So just so that taxpayers under the 90 would be shielded by the low yield.
So we've undone the solution to problem number 2.
In effect, you need to bolt another solution onto this in order to save the upper.
This is starting to look like a camel.
So here's the slide, I guess what everyone's waiting for is everything together. So first we would
10?
10.
I'm 10, yeah. So to meet the guidance set out by the committee, first we need to create, I guess I would love to change my language here. I don't want to call number 1 a circuit breaker ramp. I would call it more of a low income ramp because it's not really a circuit breaker here.
It's not a ramp here anymore either.
So
The
circuit breaker ramp, we have a maximum house site value at $400,000. We set the yields low so that the highest ventile pays 2.6%. And then we set a maximum credit to $10,000. And that raises about, after all that's done, we still have about $10 million in excess money sort of floating around in additional, because the yields are set so low. And under this scenario, about 90% of households would get a credit, but there is, as you might imagine, significant variation in the size of credits in each ventile.
Question, Graham. So if we're giving people income sensitivity on $400,000, how could they get to a $10,000 credit? Our tax rates aren't that high.
Let me just, I think when Deb did this, I'll have to quickly glance, but the tax rate to make that upper income group pay 2.6% was very high. I think it was like 298 or something. So.
Okay. Gotcha. All right.
Okay. Yeah, let me just.
Yeah, I'm going to hit the 10,000.
That'd have to be a pretty high tax rate on $400,000.
Yeah, it would be 283 would be the average homestead.
Okay, that makes sense then. Thank you.
Why if it's all three together, but the shape underneath the 65 is not the shape that you showed us in the first one? Is that because of the way we've gotten here forces the ramp to not be smooth again?
I might double check that because as I'm presenting this, I have the same question, is that you'll see, let's see, on slide, I'm skipping ahead here to slide 14. This is what I think was meant to be shown here, that purple line where we have the ramp. So I think there may be the wrong chart in here. I apologize. So if you look at slide 14,
the sledge.
you'll see there's the ramp, then there's the smooth flat, and then there's the higher income people.
Okay.
So my apologies, that's the wrong chart. But yeah, so I guess the only difference here is that choppiness at the beginning, Senator Pearson, would be the ramp that you saw earlier.
And this raises us 10 million more than we need.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And Graham, the folks between, I'm looking at the graph on slide 14, the folks between, or the households between 61 and 80 paying more than they do under current law?
That's correct. Yes. So
Is
even
that-
under the solution, we end up with a situation where we have a quite large number of taxpayers who end up paying more.
I remember last time I saw some of Deb's modeling on this, she thought part of that spot thought might be because that's where some of the AGI versus household income confusion comes in. But maybe is there another reason why that's happening? Is it just the increased rate?
I don't know why that's happening.
Okay.
I can ask Deb, but I think it's just a combination of the mechanics of the credit. So we've changed the house site to 400,000. We've changed the max to 10,000, but there still might be a lot of people where paying on property still might be better. So that might be the reason, but I don't know. I just think you're kind of maybe helping make my overall point here is that when you're making all these changes, it's almost somewhat unpredictable about within each ventile, who's going to be paying more, who's going to be paying less, and necessarily why. I mean, you can come up with an individual situation, but let me follow up with Deb to see what the reason, if there's sort of a broader reason why those people would be paying more.
And Graham, why, the ramp versus the status quo is pretty dramatic. It starts much lower. Do you have any knowledge if Deb tried to, let's say, start the very first ventile closer to where they are today, or just at one, not even 0.5%, but at 1%? I mean, is that doable as a way to just make it a little less steep, but maybe bring more people into?
Maybe lowering the top.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I'd say here is that those are the ramp is sort of the phase out that Deb chose, which is basically 12.5% gone for every $10,000 of income. So by 65, you are responsible for 100% of the calculated tax liability. Could Deb change sort of the phase out? Absolutely. I think that's something that would not be difficult to do. But I would first say kind of what I said in the second slide here, that the overall dynamic doesn't change here. So you would see a sort of flatter slope. But remember, this change only cost $14 million. It's the least expensive of the changes because these people are already quite shielded by the current circuit breaker. And so you could push this curve up a little bit, sort of make the ramp less steep. Mm-hmm. But I think that's just more of a policy question for you all about whether you think that's too progressive for the low income group or not. But overall, I don't think it changes. What it would do is just make that ramp up look a little bit steeper, but I don't think it would push noticeably the other ventiles down, because we're only talking about $10-15 million of total change here.
Okay.
I guess I'm wondering if, I wouldn't be comfortable with hitting people right in the middle there with a bigger bill, which is what this considers. So wondering if you just sort of smooth the ramp out and bring in more people, that's all.
Let's go through I'm also trying to fix the chart, but maybe the lessons will tell us something about our attempts at fixing the chart. And you made us jump ahead, Graham, because
yes, I did.
So
I will change the slide 10 to reflect the right ramp up.
Okay.
But I'm back on slide 11, which is lesson 1, which is Mark. So back before I got into the education fund, Mark Perrault, when he was giving me an overview of the education fund, he said, Graham, everything in the education fund is like pushing on a balloon. So everything you do, you push on one area of the balloon and another area of the balloon kind of bulges out. And so solving problems is very difficult in the education fund, not just within the property tax credit, but tax rates as a whole. And I think this exercise, everyone within JFO and talk with Deb, is that this is really what we see going on here. If you're trying to make adjustments to the property tax credit to make this curve smooth, is you end up in a sort of balloon pushing exercise where you're going to have to bolt new ideas onto new ideas in order to make the curve the shape that you want to get. So the bold print here is basically that, solving one issue in the property tax credit system using that existing system is almost always likely to create issues somewhere else in the income distribution, unless you do multiple things. to try to force that curve the way you want it to. So, I make the point here that in order to achieve those relatively three straightforward goals of the committee, we required at least 4 distinct major changes to the current credit. And I'm hearing already the committee didn't like necessarily that there was a group of taxpayers paying more. So we would have to do, something different to what we'd already modeled here. So you're talking, multiple different ways. So, in any single solution that we come up with might lead to desirable outcomes. And we saw that with, the fact that, if we increase the maximum credit to $10,000, it actually leads to tax increase for middle and upper middle income taxpayers. You're kind of like just pushing on the balloon. You make it better for some people, but then you push it up for other people. And that's the overall concept here, is that result is kind of what you're getting when you deal with the current property tax system, and if you're trying to smooth this curve. The second, I'm on slide 12 now. The second lesson that I lay out here with respect to pushing on this balloon is that this is really an exercise in trade-offs. So, the committee, I think, should consider the trade-offs with respect to tax principles of trying to smooth this curve. So the good news of this modeling exercise is that, if we do all 4 of these changes, we achieve, I think what I'd call imperfect vertical progressivity on an aggregate level. We managed to get the curve sort of a ramp up and then a smooth out. And then, even though there's.
Whoops, Graham is frozen. Oh, is he back? Yeah, he's moving.
No, he's back.
Am I back?
Yeah.
You're back.
Okay. So I was just saying, I think that we achieved vertical progressivity to an imperfect extent in this exercise. We managed to have a ramp up for low-income people, a smoothing out of the curve in the middle to income group, and then making higher income taxpayers pay more, but still not to the level where it would be a fully progressive curve. So that's the good news, but consider sort of the trade-off between that and complexity of the system. So, under this proposal, will taxpayers under 65,000 understand their bill any better when we have this sort of ramp down instead of a circuit breaker? And the fact that they will now be subject to a maximum credit of $10,000. We've sort of complicated the system for them a bit. And then under this system, because we pushed the house site value up to 400,000, there's a huge number of taxpayers who are not currently receiving a credit, who basically understand their bill to be whatever the assessed value of my house is times my tax rate, who will now be subject to the property tax credit. They'll receive a credit, which is good. But on the other hand, if we're coming from the place where that, quote unquote, nobody understands their bill, and the reason is because of the property tax credit, then we've, a huge number of people are now going to be in that system that are now that are not in that system. So it's good that they receive a credit and we get more progressivity, but all of a sudden on complexity, we have a large number of taxpayers that might lose understanding of their bill. And I think these trade-offs, this is the final bullet point, that this sort of trade-off about complexity, I think is the same regardless of what adjustments you make. So whether you make the ramp up a little bit more smoother instead of as steep, I think the same issues would apply. So I would encourage the committee to think about sort of this trade-off. This is a really, this modeling exercise, I think, put a lot of emphasis on vertical equity progressivity at a pretty high cost to simplicity. But that may be the goal of this committee. Equity might be the first principle here. So the second one is what I'm calling the sledgehammer. I think I said this in my October 12th testimony. And the sledgehammer is the idea.
Pejorative language.
The idea here is that it's very hard to target the results that you're looking for in terms of making people pay more or less with the property tax credit system because you are introducing a second variable into the equation, which is the house site value. And so I showed this first chart. This is after all of these 4 proposals done together. And the committee's already sort of highlighted this, but even after making the curve nice and a lot smoother, we still have a very large group of taxpayers from 60 to about 90 who are paying more in aggregate taxes than they were before. And that's because this overall system, it's very hard to exactly target what you want without making, very fine-tuned changes to the property tax credit system. The number would have to shift up a little bit more. We'd have to make the house site value a little bit more. And so you're kind of, Deb already makes the analogy of pushing buttons and turning knobs to make the sort of the curve look the way you want it to look.
Am I remembering, this is also the same sort of income bracket that tends to not experience the same benefits of EITC and to also be in the benefits trough for the child care financial assistance and.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's between median and comfortable.
Yeah. Okay.
And probably picks up a fair number of retirees living on fixed incomes, but who are still in the family home. Don't have anywhere for us to go.
With no mortgage.
I'll find you somewhere to go. Okay, thanks, Graham.
I'm on slide 14, and this is echoing what I've said before, sort of a sum up, that it's difficult to achieve the desired effects in a targeted way using the property tax system. So even if we can smooth the curve, quote unquote, across the entire distribution, the relationship between house site value and income means that, and even within each ventile, there could be an equal number of taxpayers or more paying more in taxes than there are less, in terms of counts. So even in this example, I asked Deb, after we do all this, how many households actually end up paying more in taxes? And, even though this curve looks a lot smoother, 42% of households end up paying more in property tax under this proposal than
Graham,
before.
so I want to understand that. So are you saying that there might be households in the 50 to 56 who are paying more, who are sort of counted towards that 42%? I'm picking a
Yes.
random. Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
Okay.
so even within a group where the effective tax rate has declined in this chart, within that ventile, there may be more people who end up paying a little bit more in tax and a small number that pay a lot less in tax. So it looks like the effective tax rate's gone down in that group, but in reality, a large number of them are still paying more. That's the kind of point I'm making here, is that even within each ventile, even though the chart has come down for them, or they're paying less in aggregate, within each one of those ventiles, there are a lot of tax households that will end up paying more in taxes.
Okay, and I guess it was during the last recession, but people, especially people in fixed incomes, were complaining about their property taxes. And I said, well, doesn't the state, cover a lot? Yeah, but they still went up $10 or $25. And that was more than people at the lower end could swallow. They were, is it 60% of workers are one paycheck away from being hungry? We've got that middle group. But when we talk about, that's a very small difference in lines. Are we talking about a 10% or a $10 increase, which I wouldn't notice, or a $200 increase, which I would notice? And again, that all depends on what the municipals do with that taxing capacity, because that's going to be figured into this same bill. And they aren't income sensitized, and we don't control it.
Right, and this modeling, just as I had made a note of this, but this modeling does not, so we changed the circuit breaker here to a ramp up. This modeling assumes no change to the municipal circuit breaker that's, in law. So right now we spend about $18 million a year out of the general fund to backfill.
Okay, so
municipalities.
this would just ramp up the property tax. The circuit breaker for the municipal tax would still be there and still paid out of the general fund?
That's right, but we
Okay.
haven't made any changes to that in this
Okay.
modeling construct. It's still the same as it is under current law. The only thing we've changed here is the circuit breaker for the education tax, the homestead education tax.
So folks under that doesn't pick up the folks that are looking at an increase in that middle income bracket, the median to almost comfortable areas.
Right, I'm just,
In either
yeah, I
scenario.
think, yeah, in either scenario, that's the case. It's just this, I want to just make sure the committee's under the understanding that there's nothing here with respect to the municipal tax. So
Right, okay.
the distribution of the effective tax rates for the municipal tax are a lot different than the education tax. And this modeling does not make any changes to any state program or credit or circuit breaker with respect to municipal taxes.
Municipal taxes, wealthier towns are still allowed to have a low tax rate and nice facilities, and poor town, I mean, it's based on your local income or local wealth. Because I think that hasn't been defined as a state responsibility, like education. So, and that's not going to change.
Well, it could change, but it's not going to change in this
It's not going
committee.
to change in this one. Somebody will have to sue.
I would just say, I mean, if we take a step towards equity and some people are negatively affected, that doesn't bother me. Because what it really indicates is that they've been in a really advantageous place for a while, and, you know, so.
There's zero chance we would do changes here without some people being affected.
Of course.
Yes, but 42%
Yeah, that's.
and this particular bracket we're talking about is a problem to
It's a
me.
political problem. But I mean, if you move towards equity and there's people that are disaffected, then they've been in a really advantaged position for a while. And I don't know if,
I guess I'm not sure, looking at these charts, that this would be a move
Yeah.
entirely to equity. I don't know if,
oh, I'm not
what I'm
saying
hearing.
it's necessarily.
Okay, yeah, what I'm hearing from Graham is that there are people who we would sort of consider
Yeah.
paying less to be equity, and this would
Yeah,
not
I
cost to
think
be less.
when we tried to
But I agree
lower
with
that
you,
upper tax
theoretically.
bracket after the first Blue Ribbon Commission told us to get it down, everything we did, and this was during the Great Recession, had this kind of just slight increase in middle-class taxes. And just wasn't felt that we could do that. I mean, these are probably the people that complain the most about their taxes.
I'd be willing to bet that little rectangle in there, those people right in there, those are the people that right now are paying less than the people that are paying based on income because of the property value of their home.
Are you talking about this rectangle?
That's right. That's who those people are. They're in there because they have $100,000 of income and $100,000 of home. And they're paying on $100,000 of home because it's less than $100,000 of income.
I don't know, that's a pretty big spread of people in there,
That's who
Scott.
they are.
Yeah, but these are, I don't know. This is not the group I want to be paying more. I'm just saying.
The reason.
Not when the
they're
higher
paying more is 'cause they're not
income
paying very much
groups
right
above
now.
I don't know about that. I mean, I think they're in, well, I mean, they're paying right now, they're paying based on income.
No, they're paying based on property tax, property value.
Well, the
think
red
it's
line is
general.
flat, so it must be, I would have thought that means they're protected.
I mean, in the current situation chart, the folks in that range seem to be getting significant property tax credits.
That's where income sensitivity.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they're in there, but the ones that are the ones that are creating the box are the ones that are paying based on their property tax, property value, when they would be paying more on their income. That's who's creating that box right there. It's a whole bunch of people, and in the end, some make out, some don't. But what's causing that box right there are the people
The
that.
aggregate of those people.
That's right. They are the people that are causing that box are because they are paying less in education property taxes than they would if they were paying on their household income.
Well,
Which is why we did it.
Well, Graham's going to ask Deb and try to figure out that box a little bit more. Right, Graham?
Yes, I'll ask Deb for sort of generalized conclusions about why that group is paying more.
As you get up to higher incomes and they're paying less.
Oh, Peter, hello.
There's Peter.
So my question is a little more basic, and that is, this is all based on using the tool of a much lower yield in order to put the higher than 233 ventile up to what we would call their fair share. I'm just wondering if that's our only tool available, or is that simply because this is all based on previous modeling?
So Deb and I talked about this a little bit, and I think this is on one of my slides here. Yeah, it's under slide 14. It's my second point. It's a very nice tee up for me. Is that it's very hard to make this highest ventile pay close to a state average effective tax rate just by using sort of property tax credit, or without doing something like a surcharge or a minimum tax paid. So we talked about situations where you could in theory have something in the property tax system that says if you make a certain amount of household income, you have to pay at least 2.5% of your income. That's a tool that you all could put into place. Sort of like a negative circuit breaker, or you could just say, if you make over a certain amount, then you have to pay an extra $3,000 or something. But that's not something that's been done in the past. And so when Deb was modeling this, she was thinking the only way to do this within the property tax system as we currently sort of know it is to do it through the yield. And so, but that's a takeaway here, is that it's very hard to do that without a surcharge or a minimum tax, which you could do in theory. But you still, even as this modeling example shows, if you're just going to do it on the yield, then you still don't get to the point where you have a nice smooth upward sloping curve. You still have this dip at the end. So it's imperfect.
I really like, I think it's forces us to think at this a little bit differently, but we're thinking of property tax progressivity as in the context of income. But if we think about it in the context of total education property taxes paid, we're fairly progressive right now. And so that's what makes me think that, is the way you solve maybe, which I think is in a quote you have here earlier, the way you solve income progressivity is not through a property tax. You solve it through income tax.
Which is, I guess, why we're here.
Well, if you're trying to solve this problem in the context of income.
Yes.
Yeah.
Graham, did you, let's get back to your slide deck. And you.
Yeah, so just to hammer home that point here, this is again going back to the sort of lack of ability to target, is without a specific sort of scalpel level target with respect to high income people, like a minimum tax, you're unable to make high income people pay more through the property tax system or the property tax credit system. So the third point I'd make on sort of the sledgehammer lesson here is that by doing it through this system, you're always going to be dealing with what I'm calling a moving target. So, this is a snapshot in time based upon the 2019 data set of taxpayers. But the impacts of the policy will change a lot as people's incomes rise and house values change. So to give you a sense, so when we were doing the slide deck, Julia and I, Julia had actually done a sort of similar run for this for the $400,000 house site value that's in this proposal. with Deb during the legislative session, and she noticed that the total amount of taxpayers that would benefit, or sorry, the total number of taxpayers receiving a credit would be 72%, whereas in this proposal, it's 80%. And when we asked Deb about that, she said, well, the difference here is the change in income and house size, right? So just between Julia's modeling, which was done for FY24 and FY20, which is what this is, you see a huge difference in the effect for the exact same policy. And that's because people's incomes and their house site values change over time. And so this is the snapshot of what it looks like for FY19. But I think the overall progressivity, the effective tax rate distribution that you're looking for might change, I think, in a noticeable way, you know, as early as, say, 5 years out from when you've set the limits, you know. And so it's sort of a moving target if you're just setting limits on, you know, house site values or income, or creating ramp up circuit breakers. I think over time, that policy will become out of date's not the word, but you'll have to make adjustments in order to keep the curve the way you want it to look. So that's another issue with this, is that it is somewhat inflexible to hit the desired effects. And the final thing I'll say here is that because you're dealing with house site value here as well, right? So we're not just, what the committee is sort of implicitly looking at here is really trying to achieve a goal of vertical progressivity. But as Representative Beck has sort of hinted at here, is that house site value is still very much an important part of the equation when we're dealing with the property tax credit system. And so because that house site value is in the calculation of the credit, the total tax liability for certain groups of taxpayers will never be solely matched with their ability to pay, right? So we'll have, as Representative Beck said, the people with $100,000 of income and a $100,000 house site seeing vastly different benefits than people making $100,000 in a $500,000 house site, even though in theory they might have the same ability to pay based upon income. And this is my example here, is that you might have someone who's a taxpayer in Burlington with $75,000 in income. They would almost certainly receive a larger property tax credit than someone making $75,000 in Barre for an equivalent sort of same size house. But that's because the housing values are higher in Burlington, right? And so we're using this property tax system with set values and statute for house site value and income across circuit breakers and the property tax credit. You're going to be creating, as is currently the case, much more asymmetric impacts across the state. And so it is not necessarily as tied to ability to pay as I think maybe the committee might want. So I hope that makes sense.
And it doesn't get to wealth, which has been, if you have a large trust fund, you can choose how much you draw down. So you may own a modest house, a cabin in the woods, and only draw down $40,000, $50,000 a year, even though you've got $1 million trust fund. And so that you don't get at either.
Is there a scenario where we would get at that, though?
I think that's what we've been trying to do
For 100
nationally.
years. Yeah.
That's Elizabeth Warren. It's, you know, upper income, we already went through the contortions with paying your partnership or your, LLC, and they'll pay the taxes and then they'll pay you back. And I mean, when you get to upper income, they got lots of accountants and lawyers that can figure out where to bury, and we might not come out, which is not a problem, you know, not a reason not to do it, but we might not make as much as we think we are.
Including P&I, and the income sensitivity calculation will get at a lot of that.
Yeah, I guess
And,
with that. I'm sorry.
Scott, what's P&I?
Yeah.
Principal and interest. If you include that in there, and income sensitivity is based on determined in an inverse way based on what your principal and interest is. The person with the trust with an enormous asset and is reporting low income, you can choke off that credit.
We tried on the advice of a tax accountant to put in, if you had under an income, you should count it twice in your household income. Because the norm is you have 14 times as much in the bank as you draw down. Every person on a retirement income was all over us, and how to determine that person that's getting a $7,000 annuity between and has very little in the bank compared to some others got to be higher, got to be difficult, but we could try it. It would be unpopular.
Of course, people that are in a good situation don't like to leave that.
That's right.
Graham,
I guess what I would say is that I would just zoom out to first principles for the committee here. And I think Jake Feldman talked about this in the first meeting. I think Julia and I talked about this in the second meeting, or in the October 12th meeting, about defining what ability to pay means and equity. Because so we've been talking a lot here about the effective tax rate as a share of income, which implicitly is suggesting that ability to pay should mean how much income you have should be the determination of how much you pay, right? But the problem with using the property tax credit to achieve that is that you're introducing this second lever or the second variable into the concept of ability to pay, because the property tax credit includes house site value, AKA some measure of wealth, right? And so by including the house site value, you have a system where you're trying to target a ability to pay purely on income. But in order to determine what that credit is, you're also accounting for how much wealth they have in their house. And so the committee, I think, to consider the fact that, well, if we're purely thinking about an ability to pay here, does it make sense to focus mostly on income and try to achieve it through income? Or does the committee believe that someone's house site should be considered as a factor in terms of the concept of ability to pay? Because it's sort of difficult to to sort of connect the two goals when you're looking at sort of effective tax rates as a share of income, which is sort of saying we really only care about your ability to pay based upon your income, but then going through a system which also on the back end requires some measure of wealth to be included there. So that's, I think, a sort of another broad conclusion that I think is an important consideration for the committee.
thanks. Yeah.
Graham, maybe, I don't know if you're the right person to ask, but one of the things we've wrestled with since I've been in the legislature has been how to treat capital gains. And do capital gains, and we've moved closer and closer to just treating them the way we treat income more generally. Does capital gains income show up in AGI?
Yes, it does, but capital gains is only when the asset is realized, right? So
yeah, right.
So yes, it does show up in AGI.
I just, part of the nature of my question is, I think I've accepted that there's no perfect solution. There are going to be outliers. There are going to be examples that are real and that we will not perfectly address, but they are very small in the suite of Vermonters that we're trying to look at the system for here. And, your property value, if anything, I've always thought the California system was very weird, that you get a property tax bill based on your purchase price and it locked in. But in fact, your purchase moment is when your house value reflects your ability to pay, right? That's kind of how that all works. My house is exploded in value. It's problem in a way. And it has no correlation to my income. It was lucky timing and whatever, right? And so these are really, really difficult. I don't think there's a system alive that cracks that. And so we have repeatedly come back to income as kind of the best proxy, recognizing it's not perfect. It does not capture everybody. And so I don't mean to speed. I'm just kind of thinking out loud, and I do that because I want to be corrected if I'm not thinking of this clearly. But it does come back to this question for me in part of, is there value to, in order to try to reach outliers, the lower income but high property value, or vice versa, is there value in maintaining some measure of the home site property tax? But basically shifting to income, but then keeping some percent. And I have no idea, but
What's become very clear to me from both your sledgehammer and your balloon or bubble or whatever your charming metaphors you create here, Graham, is that like this is a very tortured strategy for achieving what is essentially an income-based education tax. And so maybe it makes sense to have an income-based education tax that is supplemented by a nominal property tax, or not. Maybe, I think, or maybe it's supplemented by a nominal other tax, who knows? But this doesn't work.
right.
And that's nice that I feel like, I'm like, okay, I thought there might be, I'm like good tossing this solution out now, and that feels nice to have that tossed out.
I'm not, if what we want, we haven't gotten that top ventile up as high as maybe we'd like, but it's up. And the lower end is down. To me, the problem is those fairly moderate, just starting out. I don't think we can get into whether or not you have a mortgage.
Right.
But if we could lower or raise the beginning point, this is starting to feel like the tax credit again. If we could raise that, because that lower end started at about 1.5%, and we've dropped it down to 0.5. Could we raise that and then get those middle income folks?
I guess I don't understand why we would have these like 6 incredibly confusing levers that make it impossible for anyone to tell how much they're paying when we would achieve the exact same thing by having an income-based education tax. And I'm not disagreeing with you. I really don't understand. So I guess I'm curious why you would rather do that. 2 weeks ago, I thought I would rather do this, but now I look at how complicated this is.
We haven't been through what it would take to do a purely income-based. When we did Act 60 and we did income sensitivity, it was to make it income-based, based on incomes 20 years ago. And we've played with that. But this would be the first major adjustment. And, at some level, property is wealth. That's why we taxed it in the first place. When you were a farmer, the more land you owned, generally, the more money you made. Not necessarily the case anymore, but we've evolved. We've gone from sales tax we've gone to sales, and now we're talking about services, because that's where wealth has migrated. And the property you own is wealth. When you sell it.
It's realized wealth.
Yeah, but it's not liquid.
Well, it's more, your wealth is your equity, right?
Right.
And in your $700,000 house, you might have $40,000 of equity. And we would look at that wealth very differently than somebody who owns a.
It's not there to write a check on.
Outright. And that's why I'm not convinced it's an effective metric of wealth.
Right.
And so our task at hand is to figure out how to do something if we wanted to do it. This how doesn't, from my perspective, doesn't work.
It does seem pretty complicated.
And then there's the 42% and that are worse off. We totally lose track of the simplicity for voters.
Yeah.
You would need regular
The only thing
updating.
that would be simple would be a flat tax,
Well,
but that's not particularly equitable. But
Because you could still do an income tax, but it wouldn't be progressive, but just not tied to property value. But there's the other complications of doing it.
yeah,
I
so
come at it,
I buy a lot of property.
yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think the only good argument against the income tax is flight itself. Everything else is solvable. States all over this country do local income taxes. The only argument against it is flight, and it's more pronounced in Vermont because we already have a progressive income tax system.
and we're little.
And I guess I don't even know what scale we'd be talking about, whether or not that would even tip over into concern, right?
Yeah,
So
right. That's why I
don't
asked for
even-
more from
yes,
Stephanie.
yes, like I don't know how high we're actually talking about if we do model this entirely on income, like how high the highest bracket would wind up being in order to have the lowest bracket as low
And
as we
we
would want.
had a income-based bill sent to us by Ways and Means maybe 5 years ago.
That was
That's-
9/11. That's what led to.
Yeah,
No,
but the minute you went over average state spending, your property tax rate went through the roof.
Yeah.
I mean,
I guess I'm wondering, if, I don't know if this is the appropriate time to ask this, but if we.
Actually, will you wait 1 second? Graham, do you have anything else you wanted to share from this presentation?
help.
I know I'm not asking for help. I just like want to tie up a bow before we just go into deep discussion. I would love you to join us in the discussion, but
Yeah, I think no, I have my concluding side, but it's not anything beyond what I've already said. I just think that as I listen to the committee talk here, I think it's a really good question about, when we talk about, because this was an exercise in trying to use the property tax to achieve vertical equity on an ability to pay scale, which is defined as just income. It's very hard to do once you start bringing wealth into that equation in the form of house sites. And so I think it's good for the committee to talk through whether housing wealth should be even part of this equation at all. And if it's not, then I think that directs you more to more of a sort of standard income tax and away from this type of system, notwithstanding the idea of complexity, right? Because within this system, you're introducing a implied concept that housing wealth should be involved in your ability to pay. And so, and I think that, and I don't think it should be missed, is that housing wealth, even it might have a sort of better measure of ability to pay differently across different parts of the state. Senator Pearson talked about, in Chittenden County, right? You bought a house 10 years ago, and at that point it was a good reflection of your ability to pay. And now it might not. But if you look at a place, in the Kingdom, for instance, or, in Orange County, current property value might still be a good reflection of ability to pay, right? So I think there are asymmetries across the entire state, right? That's another thing I would encourage the committee to think about in terms of property value, right? Is that some states or some areas of the state, housing wealth may not be a particularly good measure of ability to pay, but in other places it might be, still pretty good. But trying to, again, this is the sledgehammer, trying to make it, put it all into one sort of bucket, I think produces problems, because of those asymmetric impacts. You're going to have more people in a system that doesn't work for them, and than some where it does.
I think Chris is, or is it a specific question for Graham? Because Chris
It's a
is
question
next
for
up.
Graham, and Graham, I don't know if you looked at this, this is kind of some, do you think it's fair to say that there's more property value variability across the state than there is income variability?
That's a really good question.
Okay.
I don't know. I would say on a growth, like if you looked at the past 10 years,
Yeah.
I think the dynamic would be that there is stronger property value growth than income value growth across the state. But
That's my intuition. There's a lot more variability on property value than income, but.
at least
Oh,
on the
no, that's
growth
true.
side, but I don't know about the absolute number, if that makes sense.
Right.
Thank you, Graham. Chris, what were you going to say?
Well,
For your pause.
I'm just trying to, I guess what I'm wondering what sort of a 2.5% income across the board, with some ramp at the low end gets us. Like, I'm trying to understand
Flat tax.
dollar wise.
That means average.
What's that?
You mean average or flat tax?
Well, I mean, I think it would ramp up. I don't know why the ramp starts so low here. It doesn't need to start at 0.5%. But if you started, if you take this chart, I'm looking on page 14, and you start a ramp at 1.5%, and you go up to some point around, 67, and just then cap out at 2.5%.
Or even did 1.5, then 2, then 2.5.
Yeah, something like that, my suspicion based on this is that it doesn't raise enough. But, it comes close, and then I'm just kind of curious what we're
Is
looking
it tied to local spending at all?
That's an excellent question, and I don't know. I'm just trying to, I don't know.
So I
I
think,
think it has to be probably, but I don't know.
I mean, we can
At
just,
this point in my question.
and that's an administrative question, so there's the question of what the rates should be and what that curve would look like across the state. And then there's administration questions, including like, how would it change by local spending? How do we keep renters whole, that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
right?
those are technical questions, but, right. In other words, if you did something like this shape, this is useful because the comparison, the current system even on the very first slide, the current system is comparing it to what it is on their income, people's income, right? So the low end starts at 1.5%, and the very high end is at not even 1.5%. And then there's big bumps in the middle. And so I'm just trying to figure out, kind of a cocktail party answer. Like, well, we're thinking that it would basically be 2.5% of people's income could pay for schools, and I wonder if that's true. And I don't know when we get to the point in our process where we start to play with numbers that way, but that's just been on my mind as a question.
yeah, because you'd have to take out the hump along with raising that first ventile.
So
To me, that'd be the goal, is to take out a lot.
The hump, yeah.
Graham,
Yeah, I guess what I'd say here, just speaking to Senator Pearson's sort of, I like the version cocktail thing. At that point, I think something like that, it would be very hard to achieve for the property tax system. And so like at that point,
Yeah, no,
we're not calling it a
We're
property
talking
tax
income.
anymore.
yeah, so you're basically in the income tax world, and then you're
Right.
more or less creating an income tax that replaces or,
Yeah,
that
not basically, we are, that's,
We call it an education-based income tax.
yeah,
that either replaces entirely the homestead tax or
yes.
a good
Or
chunk
the
of it.
opposite.
Yeah, I guess that's what I would. A professional recommendation is that's what you would do rather than trying to fiddle with the property tax credit. So
Yes.
that's something you could easily design with an income tax. And then I think from there on out, it's more a question of, I think if you're going to go with something like that, it's whether you're going to replace the entire homestead property tax with something like that. So that gives you a target for how much money you need to achieve, right? So that's question one. Question two is, do you want it tied to local spending decisions? And I think that has a whole bunch of administrative complexities associated with it. I think Jake Feldman talked about. And so I think what I'm sort of hearing in this discussion is that, you know, shifting something to where income is the priority basis for ability to pay in vertical equity is, you know, that's what that system would be achieving. And if that's the goal, then it's a lot easier to achieve progressivity in terms of what people pay if you're only looking at income. And you can do that, you know, as an income tax, and you could do it with 2 brackets, 3 brackets, 4 brackets. It's pretty straightforward from there. It's just a question of how much do you want to raise, how much do you want to replace, and whether you want it tied to local school budgets. And there are, I think, several other smaller questions, but I think there's nothing particularly complex about, you know, again, this is like the cocktail version. If you're worried about ability to pay, I think it stands to reason the best way to make it happen is by doing it on an income tax if your parameter for vertical equity is ability to pay equals someone's income.
And so if we were planning on adding an education tax to everyone who files income taxes, would that expand our base beyond the folks who are on this right now?
Without question, because you know, we have a lot of renters, so they would be paying the income tax, and that's what they were paying for H911 as well. But that's a policy question. Do you want this only to apply to homeowners? So in theory, you could have some homeowners file a homestead declaration, and if they file a homestead declaration, then they are subject to the education income tax, whatever that might be. Or you might say, which I think what the House said in 2018 was that, well, education is sort of a statewide responsibility. Everyone has a stake in the system, and so everyone should pay. In which case, you would just put it on the regular old income tax form, as was proposed in H911.
And couldn't we put it for everyone on the regular old income tax form as a separate line, because it's an education tax, not an income tax? But for withholdings, folks who are renters wouldn't need to withhold because we would be doing some kind of rebate at the end. I mean, we do that for other things, right? Some people don't, you know?
Well, I mean, if I'm living in a house and the landlord lives there and he rents to me, then he's paying the property taxes out of his income or school taxes. But if I'm owned by a company or a corporation, then that's not personal income so that's not a homestead. So that's not getting paid into the income tax.
No, it's not.
Homestead.
Not homestead,
Yes. I guess I don't see yes, I agree.
So, I mean, you've got it, not all renters are created equal when it comes to if they're paying double property tax.
Well, that scenario where you're living, you are, let's say it's a duplex, then that is a duplex owner paying based on, is that a non-homestead property? It is, right?
Yeah.
So I think we would assume that some of your rent was covering.
And what's more important to me than that, and I think that's important and we can figure that out, is the idea that renters are often usually lower income. And so, I mean, I think except for like some key areas and maybe Montpelier and Burlington, but I think outside of like your major wealthier metropolitan areas, you're not most.
I want to see, I'd like to see if we have stats on that because I'm not that sure.
Okay.
It's a percentage of population because it may be outside Montpelier and Chittenden County, but that's a good portion of the population of the state lives in Chittenden County.
And I guess I would just want to make sure that folks in that situation wouldn't have a cash flow problem And so if they were likely to get a rebate at the end of the year, they would be able to not withhold
Yeah.
throughout the year,
So you, in other words.
which we can do with our income taxes on some level,
I
right?
think of what you're describing this way. A renter is liable for the income tax, and we agree, as we do today, that some portion of their rent is paid towards property tax. And then in their April filing, they make all of that get squared away in a policy sense that we have decided is equal. Now, so that's the outcome. Then along the way, to make it as easy as possible, do they have to be subject to withholding or not? And there's a good argument, I think, to say no, because the cash flow is going to net them out anyway. And
And they're going to pay the same amount of money.
right, so why make them pay every month their
Yes.
paycheck and then give them a big rebate?
So this is basically 9/11, except 9/11 didn't get rid of the property tax entirely.
You know, what 9/11 did is it created a uniform education income tax that raised $60 million. Everything else, as far as income sensitivity remained intact, as did renter rebate. And then it redefined education spending. So as to what would count towards the local tax rate. There was a base level of spending, and then everything beyond the base was subject to the local decision. Yeah, those are the three big pieces of it.
And that last piece, is that relative to the piece of the income tax, or that was done for other reasons?
It was done as a cost containment mechanism to make those dollars beyond a certain point a little more expensive. It also eliminated the excess spending threshold too.
Wealthy towns can afford to put in sports complexes, and poor towns can't afford to fix their roofs. I mean, that's the situation we've got now.
Yeah.
And in order to comply with Brigham, that all gets thrown into a pot and then distributed equally. This, I assume, to comply with Brigham, we'd have to take all the income and redistribute it so that the poor towns would get their share of the wealthier towns' money.
Well, all the income would go into the education fund and then be
In
distributed to
9/11,
the towns
it was
according
just
to whatever their
Right.
budget
It was
was.
another revenue source. So yeah, it was Brigham compliant.
But so what 9/11, I guess there's sort of two levers here. So there's we could have entirely we could entirely replace the homestead tax with an income-based education tax that we figured out some mechanism for it to vary with local spending.
Yeah.
Or we could leave some base level of homestead tax that varies with local spending as a way of sort of having,
Or it could be fixed.
or it could be fixed.
Statewide.
Yeah,
Could be fixed and vary the income.
and vary the income.
Yeah.
Because that presumably would be the bigger portion of the fund, which you would want. you'd want.
9/11 was the opposite. It had a fixed income contribution, but it had a local property tax rate. But you could flip that.
One question that I have about that I think we would need to model to some degree is I imagine that if we were going to change an income tax to vary by district, that was something that would need to be reconciled at the end of the year, not something that would need to be part of the withholding, because that would be a nightmare to have it be part of the withholding. And so if it's reconciled at the end of the year, I guess I'd want to know how much variability we have between districts
About the same thing.
on their tax rates.
Well, if you're.
And I know we're about to have a lot more variability in tax rates in a few years.
But if your income rate varied, it might benefit the kingdom if they had a low income rate because they're low spenders. I mean, would people move out of Chittenden County?
Right.
Would they-
In a good way, you're saying, incentivize.
It might I just remember the days when people moved just over the line outside of Montpelier to avoid the property taxes. And Act 60 kind of leveled that. I'm wondering if we went, and they'd tell you, there's a couple condo developments in Berlin, are full of them. if they would do the same thing from wealthier towns just over the line into your poorer neighbor. I mean,
Isn't that, I mean, I think people do that now.
Yeah.
People do that in my area now.
But I don't think there's not much variability. I mean, I know the four district tax rates in my area, which is, you know, the low's $1.26, the high's $1.51. There's a couple right in the middle. The average statewide is about $1.40 right now. So there's not so much variability. I think that somebody would say, I'm picking up and moving. But I mean, the people that move around a lot
more when you
are
add-
renters, right? Those are the people that move around a lot.
Right.
And they wouldn't be
No.
subject to this, so.
Well, they would be, but they would.
But
that-
Oh,
effectively
yeah.
have covered it,
Yes.
presumably.
To rent or read.
we're building a lot of affordable housing, which will be primarily renters too, on that low income level.
For people, but those are for people who live here now, so it's not like it would change a population. Andy, you had your hand,
Well, I'm
but
wondering,
you've taken it back. I'm not sure if you want to talk or not.
It's not, it doesn't have conviction yet.
and maybe it's just too into the weeds and it's something we could talk about later, but it's the question about trying to tie the property tax to the vote of the school budget. Why do we need to do that, basically, is my question. Like, can't that just get figured out on an annual basis, like everything else we use the income tax to pay for?
Yeah, it could get reconciled on the income tax annually, absolutely.
You don't have to have a complicated system of they voted here and then that changes your income tax rate, or your income tax rate changes per even school district.
Do you mean, why do we need to have rates tied to local spending?
Yeah.
Or do you mean
A flat surcharge.
at all in
yeah.
Vermont? I think because it's the foundation of all of Vermont's
If you don't have a
ethics,
local,
but
if you don't
I'm
have
happy
a
to
local
entertain it.
education income tax rate, then Montpelier is determining how much your district spends.
Which is
Well,
what
they
the
could
rest
still
of the
vote on
country
it.
does.
But if there's no tax, I mean,
I mean, obviously, the tax.
1% at a time.
Some point you got to raise the tax to raise that money.
yeah.
But you just do it the next year, I
Well,
guess.
but why would, but then Burlington's gonna just keep spending more and more because you're gonna pay it. Like,
Well, if it's based on income, just everybody in the state would pay for it, yeah, so.
yeah, that's,
But it's gonna hurt the lower income people more. I mean, I can just vote up having my school do anything because I'm wealthier. But
Right.
in order to
That's
meet
the way-
Brigham, the folks up in Albany are gonna have to share in that cost.
this is why the adjustment is at least makes some sense, right? It's an adjustment that your property tax bill, your school bill now is impacted by other districts' decision, but it's also impacted by your own decisions.
Disproportionately by your own decision.
Right, which is, I think there's a lot of logic to that.
But Andy, you're suggesting what would happen if we stopped doing that entirely?
Yeah, that was just like a thought.
Yeah.
Exercise, not a proposal.
Then I think that is maybe like one of the biggest fundamental issues here. If you're going to move to an income tax, is whether you still want that income tax tied to local school budgets. And I think, like, if the committee is, moved off of, say, the property tax credit system is going towards an income tax system, then in my sort of professional opinion, the next question is whether you want that income tax tied to local school budgets. Because if the answer is no, then I think this becomes a relatively straightforward, simple construct.
Simple but not fair.
Well,
Why
I
is it
mean,
not fair?
It's
It's
I guess
fair,
that's
it
what.
just doesn't have a connection to the vote.
Well, it's not fair because it doesn't have a connection to the vote in that you will be a school that decides for a 10% increase, has spread that across everybody in the state. And the school that decides that to be level funded has saved everybody in the state, and neither, and
They pay the
it doesn't, and then they'll pay this. So then why wouldn't everyone just say, well, I think we should have a 20% increase?
Because they know that their income tax will go up next year.
But some people can afford to have their income tax go up more than others.
Well,
That's kind of the way now with the property taxes too. You can vote yes because you don't
Yeah.
care about the income.
Graham, regardless of whether or not we tie it to local spending, which is certainly a question, there would still be some complication from the fact that the yield does need to change every year. And so we would need to raise a different amount every year. And so unlike the general fund, it would still be a rate that would need to change on your income tax every year.
Right. So that's exactly where I was going to go next. Is that potentially could be where, I don't know if this is true, but that could be where the potential cost containment comes from, because there's no reason you have to per se set a yield. You could make the property tax system, not the property tax, the income tax system be sort of a structure of 3-4 brackets, and whatever you collect is whatever you collect. And so the what you're calling the yield is what I would call, well, if the money is short, then you would have to adjust the income tax rates in some way. Either, I mean, I wouldn't even call it a yield.
Let's call it the education taxes, not the income taxes. I think it makes it less confusing.
Yeah, I mean, you'd have to adjust the education tax. And so the potential for cost containment here could come from the fact that, well, any individual school board would have to know that if they're going to start voting 10% school budgets across the board, then if the state economist is projecting X amount coming in from the education tax, then it's going to have to force up education tax rates, and that might keep them down. And so I guess what I'm saying is that, I don't think it has to be done through a yield, but every year you're going to have to evaluate whether the amount forecasted by the state economist for the education tax is going to be sufficient, or whatever that amount is, and whether the locally voted school budgets are close to that number. Because if they're not, then the legislature is going to have to adjust the income tax rates up, not necessarily with a yield, but just by, you could just tweak every bracket by 0.5%, for instance, or you could just put it onto one. It's very much a general fund type construct.
So that's already what we do with the yield to some degree.
Yeah.
We say, is the amount that is the rate that we had last year enough to be raising how much we need to raise this year? We also have the option of having it that rate not change and have any difference made up in the non-homestead rate.
Right, but I guess what I'm saying with this construct is that with the current system, you know what you need to pay for before you set the yield, typically in the legislature. Under this system, I imagine the state economists would make a forecast for what would be collected under the current system. And so school budgets would know what's available when they go to set their school budgets. And if, in aggregate, if that number is much more than the income tax, and the legislature would have to sort of solve the problem on the back end, similar to how they do now, but at least going, a priori, before they set school budgets, the school boards would know what the state economist is projecting for, given the certain income tax rates that are set in statute, then what would be raised. So I guess what I'm saying is that that's a way you could sort of potentially get cost containment without actually tying it to school budgets.
I think Julia had something she wanted
I
to say.
also just, thank you, Director Joint Fiscal Office, wanted to reiterate, going back to H911, that the homestead, if you were to maintain some sort of homestead rate, that could be tied to local spending sequence.
Okay,
So it doesn't
because
necessarily, of course, you're talking about all these different options, and that's another option in terms of maintaining connection of some rate to local spending.
and would this just be the homestead? So people that have a homestead would pay an income tax surcharge instead of a school property tax, but the businesses and second homeowners would be paying a property tax, or would they also pay an income tax surcharge?
I think we were talking about the non-homestead, just staying the non-homestead tax, which is a property tax.
So how would we set that property tax?
I think,
Homestead?
It's set in statute already.
Yeah, but it's adjusted along, it floats up or down according.
I think that's what I was saying, is that we could use that as the floating rate that closes the gap. if we wanted to.
And the way I think of it, everybody would pay it. Like we would try to do this system where you file your homestead, and then if you file the homestead, then you get the income tax. Because then what if they just don't file the homestead?
Yeah, I think just it's
Why not
on
just
everyone's income tax.
Right.
Yes.
file income tax in Vermont, subject to line 14, which is the income for schools.
Okay, so.
So you just make up
then
that line
Do
number.
we do away with the property tax
Yeah. For your home.
for your, yeah, but if,
Or not?
yeah, if I am not a resident and I'm earning some income here during COVID, I'm going to pay income tax. What if I don't owe any income tax? What happens to the second homeowners?
They're not homestead.
They're not paying the,
Well, so
They
that,
might pay the income tax if they have income. If they file an income,
Okay, but what
I
if
think
they
we've
don't?
already, so I think we've already decided that folks who file income taxes in Vermont have a stake in the success of Vermont and are using the infrastructure of Vermont and so should pay some portion of their income tax. And so I think this sits on that same assumption. So if someone pays partial income tax in Vermont, we'd still be saying like, you benefit from our well-educated populace and our healthy children, even if your kids aren't going to school there, the same way people who don't have children benefit from our school and pay school taxes. And then people who don't earn any income in Vermont wouldn't be paying this, but they might have property and they'd be paying the non-homestead, which we're not.
So you'd have a
changing.
dual system for people that earn income in this state, you would pay an income. If you don't have income in this state, you will continue to pay property.
Do you mean,
if it's
are you
a
talking?
homestead property.
You can be a homestead property owner with no income right now.
Yeah.
And your property tax you pay would be zero unless you.
And now
max
it's
out
already
the-
very low, right?
Unless you max out the $5,600 credit. I mean, any percentage on zero is zero.
So, Anne, are you talking about a scenario where someone just has a non-homestead property and earns income in Vermont? Would be paying
No,
both of those things?
I'm talking about someone that doesn't earn, because in that second non-homestead, you've got businesses, and I don't know what we're gonna do with them.
leaving them just where they are.
Okay.
Not touching them.
And then you've got the folks that live in Barry, Montpelier, have a second summer home up in Grand Isle.
Okay.
All right. Are they going to pay on that second home?
They're still going to pay property taxes.
They're still going to pay property tax on that. And they're going to pay an income tax.
The same way right now they'd be paying
Okay.
on their two properties.
But somebody that owns a nicer second home up there is only going to pay property tax.
Well,
They don't have it.
so think of it, I think of it this way. You have we have right now paying into the ed fund, the non-homestead and the homestead.
Right.
We're gonna leave the non-homestead right where it is. So second homes, so people that don't have their first homes, if you're a business, you're all doing exactly what you do today. So then the homestead would no longer pay an education property tax or be income sensitized. That class of people by and large would get picked up by virtue of a percentage of what they file their income tax.
Okay.
A local education income tax.
Yeah.
Okay. And the state would continue, the legislature would set the property tax rate on the second homes right now based on what?
Based on what's needed in the fund.
Yeah.
The same way we do now.
Now, we do set it,
We set it, but then it's supposed to go up or down the same percentage as, so it is somehow tied.
So the bills are the
to
same.
spending.
Yeah. Average bill moves the same direction, the
Right.
same magnitude.
and yeah, I don't think that would change.
Change.
So essentially, right now, we set the non-homestead based on what is needed in the ed fund. We do it sort of on two levels. First, we say what's the homestead based on what's needed in the ed fund, and then we sort of match the non-homestead to that. But if we just set the non-homestead based on what's needed in the ed fund, it would still have the same impact on the ed fund and on the non.
And we would be having the discussion about the income tax rate. You know, maybe it goes up a 0.05 rate.
We already do. That's the income yield, right? We already do that.
Yes, we set the income yield.
That's right. So I think it would be in those steps similar to what we do today.
Yeah, I don't, that part I don't think would be very different. I think the impact for people paying would be very different because it'd be much more straightforward.
Can we model this?
What do you need to know for us to model this?
I guess, so if I'm writing this down here, this kind of sounds like S212 to me. Where S212 is you abolish, or not abolish, you get rid of, there's no more homestead tax. It is
Thank
purely
you for
an
the good
income-
word choice.
You get rid of the
I'd like
homestead tax.
abolish.
It is an income tax that is tied to locally voted school budgets. And then the non-homestead tax stays in place as it always would be. And I think the only thing that was not talked about that's in S212 is, I think in S212, the way it works to achieve progressivity in the income tax rate is that there's a statewide income yield that's set, but then the tax rate is reduced by a certain percentage, if I remember right, by whatever the person's income is. And whereas what is sort of being talked about here is like a bracket structure, kind of like we have for the personal income tax.
I would rather do a bracket structure because I think that's more understandable to people who are paying. And I think you can achieve the same progressivity with a bracket structure.
Right, but doing the sort of simple personal income tax bracket structure is difficult when you're tying it to local school budgets. That's I think.
That's why I
Okay.
think we should look at not tying it to, because if you do tie it to the local budget, then you have, every town would have a different income tax, right? Each school district would have a different. And I'm not sure that complication, the amount that would complicate things is worth it. I understand that's what we've always done it, but I think we should just consider not doing it that way. And that there's other ways to do cost containment. If the reason to do that is cost containment, there's other ways to do cost containment.
No.
But if the reason to do it is just like, oh, well,
Right.
your vote has an impact on your local spending,
It doesn't shut down.
we just have to think about, is that what we want? How valuable?
I don't,
Now you just turned it up.
I don't think the reason
Oh
to,
gosh, I don't know what I did. So I just shut it down. It's all gone.
I think if you get into a situation where people are getting different levels of pupil spending for the same tax rate, I think you're getting into problems there.
Yeah, I would have thought that.
Yeah, I don't think it's a cost containment. It's it is, you spend more, you pay more, but I mean, it's more,
Always have sports centers.
it's more of an equity thing, I think,
So why is the equity a problem?
Well, you have towns that are spending different amounts of money, but they're paying the same amount of tax.
I mean, that's actually, that is already happening.
So the town would pay different, but each person would pay based on their.
Yeah, but I mean, if I have $100,000 of income in Burlington and you have $100,000 of income in Berlin, and my kid is getting a much higher per pupil spending, isn't that a violation of some kind of equity?
I think so.
I mean, I sort of agree, and that is what is already happening now in Vermont.
Yeah.
Like between a combination of waiting and the fact that people are making decisions about local spending, that is still socialized, even though there is some local impact.
It's a much more radical socialization of it.
Yeah.
It's comments like all our kids are the same. And so all
One school district.
yeah, it would be kind of like having a statewide school district.
Except people still get to have local decision
Right.
making.
And then we're trusting the school boards to say like, is this a reasonable budget?
Yeah, but 3% if you're making $50,000 a year is different than 3% if you're making $150,000 a year. And at one, it's coming out of my food budget. At the other end, it's coming out. But I suppose if you're getting an earned income tax credit and you don't owe any taxes, then you don't pay any school taxes.
You need to understand.
And I think it's, if we do follow your idea, your radical socialization of education spending, then we can do brackets very easily. And then that
Could do a bracket.
that is fixed. I mean, because it seems like the only reason to not do brackets is it makes the local spending adjustment complicated.
Isn't the local, would it be super complicated or couldn't it be done with a table in your reconciliation in April? Like if, so, you know, if the income tax rate is 1 and then you measure every school on a scale of their per pupil spending, it's not, well, people tell me.
One
No, but
less.
it's got a 2 times per pupil, right? So it's a good, right?
So one is the state
What's the
average.
variation between the highest per pupil and the lowest per pupil?
It's almost 2.
It is.
It's almost 2.
It's almost a factor of 2.
It's almost a factor of 2. So, but that says to me that your adjustment is going to be less than a doubling, right? So if everyone is paying 1%,
Well, depends on how you define education spending.
yeah.
Yeah, and
But I guess what I mean is that says to me it's kind of it's not a whopping.
well, if you're a small school, then your pupil spending is much higher because you've got 3 students as opposed to 10.
That's actually those aren't correlated
Okay.
as closely as I think we all think they are.
But we're already doing this kind of calculation where
Yes.
it's not a straight up per pupil spending. We understand there's variation and then we have some part of the formula that gets zeroed out. Am I right?
So much of there's like a bajillion steps.
Yeah, there are things right now that do not count towards education
Yeah.
spending.
So I guess what I'm wondering is that maybe it is good to think about the radical socialization about it, but I can say that my time in Montpelier has been very difficult in the sense that nobody owns it, right? Locally, they get complain about Montpelier. We all feel like, well, I don't know, we just take the budgets and pass the yield. And nobody sort of feels control, and that's not a healthy part of the system, I would argue. So I wouldn't want to make that even
Yeah,
worse.
the control is at the local level.
One thing I would want to understand in a model of this is if we used sort of a supplementary homestead tax as the thing which is, I think, sort of what's in 9/11, as the thing that fluctuated along with local spending, would we be able to set a rate that was low enough that we wouldn't need to make income adjustments on it?
Interesting.
So that could be a simple, straightforward.
So are you thinking of, use the words statewide or local? Are you talking about a statewide property tax and a local income tax?
No, it would be a local property tax and a statewide income tax. The property tax, we would set it the same way we set the homestead now. We would just need to have a much, much lower yield because we would have all this other money in the fund from the income. And so if we had the much, much lower yield, could we set the yield low enough
Well, we could have the
that
income charge be low enough, be progressive enough that it could also.
Yeah,
Isn't that what
that's,
9/11 was?
If you have a statewide
Wait.
rate, there is.
Can I finish explaining what
yeah.
so is it possible to have that local property tax rate low enough that it can adjust in the range it needs to adjust to account for local spending, but it's also low enough that we wouldn't need to income sensitize or circuit breaker or anything like that, anyone, that it was like West Virginia style. Graham, you know about West Virginia taxes, right? It would be like West Virginia style property taxes.
Let me make
I
sure I
don't.
understand what you're
But what
you're talking about, a local property
A
tax rate?
statewide
Right.
property
Statewide
tax that
property tax
fluctuates
rate,
locally,
okay.
not,
So a
yes.
statewide,
We have to-
you're talking about a statewide property tax rate.
Talking about what we have now.
Yeah, but 10% of what we have now or something.
Yes, like the homestead, just
You
way,
would
way
have
lower
a
than
Yeah,
that.
okay, so you're talking about a
statewide income tax.
statewide homestead education property tax rate that would be low enough that we would feel comfortable in not including income sensitivity.
Yes,
Like everybody would pay it.
but was high enough to be able to fluctuate according to local spending.
And you would
It would
waive.
just be a notwithstanding, just like we always do.
Yeah.
Just like we do the
bulk you
non-
raise would be with an income tax, which would be bracketed.
Yes.
Said progressive.
Especially with this scenario.
Yes.
because
Not
you
tied
have to really ratchet down the bracket for.
So basically.
Peter has a thing he wants to say, I think.
I was just gonna, just sort of following that logic, aren't we really then returning to a foundation formula where the foundation is raised by a statewide income tax? And that the local fluctuations within that spending get made up for in the local property tax?
No, because people still get to decide their spending
Yeah.
entirely locally and the bulk of the money still comes to them automatically. It's not that, no,
It's kind of like the sales tax into the education fund.
Yeah.
The income tax would just go to the
Yeah.
education fund.
yeah.
So
It just-
you just can use
And
that
the
local property tax.
would have to go there too, because it all has, it's,
It would be no different than taxing services. You're just putting a revenue source into the ed fund
Right.
before the local.
property tax gets set.
So what you're doing there is, which I mean, is you're taking a low statewide property tax rate without income sensitivity. Okay, and what you're doing is you're buying down the local education income tax rate.
Yes, in a really significant way with an income-based education.
And you're allowing that to be adjusted based on local decisions so that we have some maintenance.
Well, it's all based on local decisions when it gets to us. Right.
Not gonna be here anymore.
Districts, the bill that they see on their property would still be.
No, it wouldn't reflect the local decision. It would reflect the statewide. decision.
Statewide cumulative decision.
Both
Otherwise-
always
Yeah.
would still, and we would set, and yeah,
The income tax would be set, would be like a surcharge. It would just be a flat, it wouldn't be connected to the local spending. So
Right.
everybody would have the same.
no, we could still set that as an income yield even every year. That could also fluctuate every year. It just
Might
wouldn't
have to
change by local.
fluctuate.
It doesn't sound,
But it would be based on each district.
It wouldn't be based on each district.
So what rate is driven by the local decision?
Well, so both the income tax and the homestead and the non-homestead could all be driven by the collective local decisions.
Statewide decision.
The statewide sum decisions, but the only thing that would be adjusted would be the homestead.
I think it would be adjusted based on local spending.
Yes.
Would be the
Yes.
homestead.
I thought you were saying that.
It's sort of like take what we have today for the homestead and shrink it by 85%. Right?
Yes.
And then that the balance is made up by some kind of income structure.
And I mean, I'm curious about that. And then the other thing I'm curious about is just like totally getting rid of the homestead, doing it in brackets. And if it's possible to do something to adjust at the end of the year, the way you described, Chris, based on local spending.
I think I'm still not on the same, so I'm still not clear about whether we're talking about a local education homestead tax or a statewide education homestead tax.
statewide.
Statewide, okay.
Adjusted locally, just like today.
Not adjusted locally, adjusted based on the entire, okay.
Right.
Wow. Yes.
Yes,
It makes a big
But
difference.
each district would have a different,
No, okay, that's what I'm trying to get at. I mean, if it's a statewide homestead education property tax rate, then everybody in the state pays.
Would be.
So you're talking about a local education homestead property tax rate.
A fraction of the system.
But smaller than what we have now. I
Yes,
understand.
but the
Okay.
exact same thing.
But you're talking
System
about
shrunk down to about by 85%.
So you're talking about a local, a much smaller, with no income sensitivity, a local education homestead property tax rate, and a local education income tax rate.
State.
I
A state, you're talking about a statewide education income tax rate, where everybody in the state pays the same, okay, so
Yeah, but-
that's 9/11, okay.
That's what I was gonna say.
That's
Yeah.
9/11.
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Although I think you're talking about a bigger chunk than $60 million, but I don't really know that.
Yeah, I think it's changing the ratios from 9/11.
Okay, so heavier on the income. Okay, all right, okay.
So, and then, I mean,
That's the idea, at least.
I want I don't understand how to do what you are asking about, Chris, and I think it's a really good idea. I just can't imagine my way to it, and I don't know who can imagine their way to it. But to reconcile, to have brackets and to reconcile at reconciliation time with your income taxes when you're filing, to have it tied to local spending somehow. I just can't imagine my way towards that. I don't think it's a bad idea, though.
It's dangerous to have this recorded because I don't know what I'm talking about. So basically, the idea is
You're the only one not running for reelection.
Yeah, just say it.
I have long given up worrying about. So you have whatever were set, and it wouldn't matter if it was tiered or sloped. You know, what would show up on my income tax, let's say, let's just call that a unit of one. Okay. And it's probably be 2.5%, but it's a unit of one. And then you would look at, I live in the Burlington School District. So Burlington is 1.5 times the base level per pupil.
A factor, yeah.
It's whatever factor is.
Yeah.
So then my unit would not be 1, it would be 1.15. And so I would adjust it locally that way because that's my, you know, it would be a kind of akin to the adjustment that we make.
That's what we do now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And except for it would, what I would want to understand and what we would obviously need to understand is how much variety that creates. But
Because the withholding won't work well
Right.
unless it creates a lot of variety.
yeah, right.
And just the timing.
creates a lot of variety.
When you do it on what year.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, we can always, it wouldn't be that hard to be a year backwards or a year forwards. I think but if the withholding doesn't match up well with the reconciliation, then we're putting people in a lot of trouble, right?
Gosh.
Yeah. Individuals cash flow, not state cash flow. Yeah.
Right.
Or district cash flow.
But that.
It seemed like you could see your way towards something like that for a minute.
Yeah, so I think what Senator Pearson's saying makes sense. So I'm imagining a system where you have I don't know, let's say it's a structure of 3 brackets, right? And all those brackets are multiplied by a factor depending upon what district you live in. And the average district would have a factor of, say, 1. So if your per pupil spending in your district was the exact as the state average, your bracket would be multiplied by just 1. So the same, but if your spending is higher, then that sort of rate gets added to by, say, 3% or something like that. So like 1.03 if your average per pupil spending is 3% higher, or sorry, if your per pupil spending in your district is 3% higher than the average. That's what I understand. And I think that makes sense. I think that is doable. I think the only problem here is, as you all were suggesting, is the withholding, right? And so people will be sort of withholding based upon or not knowing whether their per pupil spending is going to be higher or how much higher or lower than the statewide average. So you could use your previous years, right? Like that's an idea, and you would probably get pretty close. But you know, I guess what the only thing I'd add to this is that's sort of just how the income tax works already, right? You know, you reconcile at the end of the year. That's not unusual overall. So it's I think that's a doable system.
I also think in terms of if everyone is looking and understanding their education taxes according to an explicitly spelled out relationship to the state average, that is a much more transparent way to understand your district spending than I think how it's communicated now. And there's like lots of social psychology that people sort of invent what other people do in a much exaggerated way to what people actually do and then adjust their decision-making accordingly. And so it's sort of interesting to think that we would be sort of like sharing normal in such an explicit way with voters.
You would have to have a year lag because, as we've learned many times, the software packages have to be ready in December.
Yes.
You can't wait till March and then try to jam it out there.
Because I think as you were describing it, I was imagining people with a pen and no one actually does their taxes that way, including me.
I mean, it wouldn't be, just to tell somebody at town meeting and say, listen, this is the local education income tax rate you're going to pay. And it's going to be based on whatever you earn this year. We don't know what that is right now. But you'll figure out exactly what it is next year when you file.
Okay, would this also have the local property tax?
What do you mean?
Well, we started this discussion with, we're going to have a statewide, and then a local.
We're trying to figure out.
I think it's the one or the other. I think
One
we
or the
don't need the
other,
local
okay.
property tax. I think the local property tax only exists in order to create a feasible adjustment. And I don't think we need it if we have a feasible adjustment on the income.
Okay.
What it does is it buys down that education income tax rate is what it does.
Yeah, it does.
And it, I think you could argue it helps with some of the outliers.
Sure.
Really
It helps with a couple other things too. It helps with stability.
Right.
You've got a three-legged stool now instead of a two-legged stool. And I think it also is an argument against flight. Because you got the person with the $1 million home, they're going to have a much lower property tax, but they're going to pay, it's 1% on instead of 2.5 or something like
Because
that.
if they flee, they still pay the non-homestead rate.
And they pay the non-homestead. That's right.
And we're not getting rid of property taxes anyway. So you're going to always have to figure out what your property is valued at anyway.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
it's not that much of an extra burden.
No, I think, but again, this is, the spoiler at the end is if you're not hitting those people at the end, you're not really, you might not be gaining much progressivity either.
Just for that very end, you might.
As a function of income, not as a function of total education taxes paid, which I really like that the way, they're paying, what is it? The top 5% are paying 16% of all education income
Right.
taxes.
Right.
I don't know. I mean, I guess they could pay more, but they're certainly paying more than their.
Don't worry, they got half of the wealth.
I know, they got it.
Okay, we have 3 minutes left.
Oh, we made some great progress.
We have Graham who's going to say something brilliant in his final
I
3
just
minutes.
wanted to raise one, not to be a stick in the mud here, but one thing that you have to consider when you're doing something like what Senator Pearson is suggesting is I'm not imagining this system is tied to a yield of any sort. So what you're living with here is we'll be modeling sort of an income tax or creating an income tax bracket that raises X amount of dollars in a given year. And you are sort of resigning yourself to sort of the whims of whether you raise more or less than what you need in a given year for education taxes, if that makes sense. So let's say the way this designed is you have a bracket structure with 3 rates, and then the rates go up or down depending upon whether your district is spending below or above the statewide average, right? We can predict how much money that's going to receive, but in any given year, you might have spikes in income that lead to more revenue coming into the ed fund than you expected, which would lead to a surplus situation or vice versa in a recession. So you kind of live with that volatility when you're not setting the rates every single year to
Well,
try
Graham,
to.
we already live with that volatility. We already have surpluses in the ed fund from year to year.
Right, but only from the non-property tax revenues and
Yes.
the sales tax, person use tax. But now you would be introducing roughly $450 million subject to sort of that hit or miss cycle, which it might be fine for the committee, but I want to flag that every year you're not going to be setting rates.
And I think that's why it's really important to keep the non-homestead on some sort of yield lever. And maybe this other,
Why wouldn't we be setting rates every year? I mean, we used to do that when we were as a portion of federal. I mean, that's not an unimaginable option.
Oh yeah, for sure. You could set yield, you could set, not yield, you could set the rates differently every single year depending upon
Sure.
how much is projected to come in. But this is like, I'm imagining an exercise done as part of the consensus forecast, right? So we'll know how much income we have as a base. We'll know which districts are below and above the statewide average, at least from last year. And then we'll make a forecast. But I think what this is not going to be is like a statewide yield setting exercise like it is currently, where we know exactly how much we need in advance and then we set a yield and then that guarantees. So I think this is a slightly different system. I don't want to flag that for.
We need a
And-
bigger reserve.
yeah, so I think that's helpful to know sort of where we would want to put other levers. We don't know how much we need when we set the yield. Not all of the spending has come in yet.
That's right.
So I also want to clarify that, especially when we set the yield on the House side.
Yeah.
We're like really just, negotiating something with Brad James's imagination on some level.
I would just,
That was not fair. There's a lot of information that we have and spending does not change that much from year to year, but we definitely don't have full information.
if we're talking about a local education income tax, I would be uncomfortable moving away from a yield system. When you start saying 3 categories, you're talking about cliffs, you're talking about everybody will spend up to the highest amount before they go into the next category. I would be hesitant to move away from a yield system.
Can we model this? Because I need to see it. I mean,
Yeah.
we had this discussion until the graphs came in today and then it didn't look so good. So, because income again can be volatile if the recession hits. Then are we going to put all of the burden onto second homes and businesses, because it's usually not a good time to raise business taxes during a recession?
Well,
So,
clearly
okay.
we need to model.
We have 1 minute left. We're 1 minute past. Scott, I just want to clarify, are you saying you're uncomfortable moving away from a yield and having brackets, or if we had brackets?
I'm
That
uncomfortable
would be
moving
okay.
away from a yield just because
Okay.
I'm just, cliffs, I don't like. And, if you have a window, if you're in this window, you get this rate, and everybody's just going to go up to the highest spot they can go.
But we could have brackets and a yield. Would that be
Income brackets, you mean,
income brackets and yield?
not brackets.
Just on the bracket issue, I mean, what I heard Graham saying, I think we've lost him, but was that you would actually just graduate it based on per pupil spending increases. I mean, he was talking about 1.03, rather than having 1.5, 2, 2.5.
We could do both simultaneously.
Yeah.
But, okay, it sounds like we are very close to knowing what we want to look at.
So H911 with a bigger income
You
piece.
guys feel like you have enough to pull something together there?
I think, so Graham had a hard stop at 4, so he had to head out.
Okay.
I think, I've heard sort of 2 big picture ideas with respect to pulling something together. I think we would need to hear more what it is that the committee is hoping to see with respect to both or either of the systems. We could go back and think about some of the remaining questions. It sounds like the 2 systems that have been batted around are, 1, having a locally adjusted homestead tax, which is like what we have right now, and have that be a very small portion and the remainder picked up by an income bracketed tax. Those brackets dependent on household or AGI or whatever it is, but
AGI. I think we all agree
Okay.
AGI.
those brackets based on AGI. And that would be uniform across the state, not homestead would stay. And then the other option that it sounds like the committee is interested in is having a state, getting rid of the homestead tax, having a statewide income tax where if districts spend above that statewide average, then rates would increase proportionately. So you've got, maybe it would be bracketed by AGI, maybe not, but if your district spends 3% over, then that income tax rate is going to be multiplied by 1.03.
Yeah.
So is that?
Yes,
Yes,
Did I capture the two ideas?
yes.
you did.
Okay. So
And let's,
yes,
yeah.
in terms of the committee and meeting a week from now,
I think we can figure out some of the details. Some of like the details of what exactly we would need to see, maybe tomorrow morning or something.
that sounds
Okay,
great.
great,
Yeah.
okay.
So statewide property tax rate, local, is that what you, is that what?
Well, there's two different ideas.
Two totally different
So
scenarios.
where do you, are you?
One is a 9/11 and one is not.
If you go back to the presentation that I
Okay.
gave to the committee
Yep.
on October 12th,
Okay,
The options.
and there were the different options, the potential options. One is on slide 5, it was that option B of adding the education income tax to the ed fund as another revenue stream, keeping property taxes.
trying to catch up with you here.
Okay.
October 5th, you said?
October
You wanna just look
12th,
at my device?
Our most recent meeting a couple weeks ago.
Okay, all right. Option B.
So that's that H911 construct. And there would be wrinkles to be ironed out just based on the conversation the committee has had today. This is really just big picture what we're thinking about.
So you're statewide local education, a statewide education income tax rate, okay. All right,
And then the other really falls into that option C category where the homestead property tax would be replaced with the education income tax. That wouldn't be tied to a statewide yield. And it would be adjusted, it sounds like based on Senator Pearson's.
I think the question is, what would it look like to tie that to a statewide yield?
So I understand tying an education income tax to a statewide yield is really going back to the construct of S212, which is
yeah.
when it's tied to a statewide yield, it's tied to local spending
Local,
decisions
local.
through the yield.
Yes.
So it's, if you want to have that, so I think one of the really big questions is that education income tax going to be tied to local spending decisions?
And I think for the one that's just an education income tax, then yes, it would need to be. And that's the one where we would do the times 0.5 times whatever, the end.
But that's
And-
not option B.
No, that's option C. We're talking about two different scenarios.
So I kind of see like the path of the committee, if I may, and sort of like at another fork in the decision tree, right? It seems as though we've moved past the adjusting of the different thresholds.
Yes.
And now the next decision fork that the committee is at is that education income tax going to be tied to local spending decisions? And the other fork is the homestead property tax going to be retained? And they seem to be hand in hand. And so if there's something that we could put together to help the committee move further with that conversation or just decision point, or if it's something that you want to get back to us tomorrow about how that would work, but that's kind of in terms of my professional mind, where I see the committee at, in terms of this progress.
I think that's a good summary.
Yeah. But what we need to make the decision is, I'm not sure. So that's, it's like, so graphs, that's obviously not helpful, but you know, like how you tell us the impact of those two decisions.
I'm just gonna, and I remember when this thing got modeled through 9/11, and I really, to be able to put together a model that's gonna be worth something, I really think what you want to do is to have a statewide education income tax with brackets, okay? And then a local property tax rate.
That's one of the choices.
Yeah, I think that's how the model's going to work out, because if you go the other way, you're going to have a real big problem with your lower income people.
So ultimately, policy.
So we're, I think, about to re-enter the weeds rather than the weeds.
Because I'm getting worried about the lower end.
Well, we're all gonna, why would, there's nothing that is having, there's no conflict between having a tiered income tax and having it be adjustable
Adjustable by what?
by the local, by the
decision.
same kind of thing we've been talking about, by your comparison to the average spend.
So I mean, that's all I'm saying is, yeah, you're right. But, so that's what I think we still are like, are we talking about a local education income tax rate or a statewide education income tax rate? And are we talking about a statewide homestead property tax rate? Or are we talking about a local homestead property tax rate? And I don't think we're
In my mind, we're talking
entirely
about
clear.
two different models.
Totally different proposals.
Okay.
One is just a straight, a tiered, bracketed income.
Local?
Well, it's local in the way that the homestead rate is local today. So it is adjusted based on
Local
local.
decision. Okay, okay.
But that's
Okay.
one model.
Okay.
It's some number, this is where I don't feel fair to you guys. Some number of tiers at some level.
Okay.
Then each of those get adjusted on your April.
Okay.
True up. That would be one model.
And then what happens on the homestead?
Nothing.
away.
It goes away.
It goes to
It
zero.
goes away. Okay, all right.
The other model would be a more, probably also tiered income tax,
Okay.
but just one rate for everybody. And then
So a statewide tiered.
So 9/11 with just different ratios.
and
Okay,
then a very small remnant of the current homestead tax.
and it's statewide.
No income adjustment on that, but that's
The small local homestead is where the income is adjusted, is where it's adjusted.
but it's not income sensitized.
No, it's not income
Adjusted locally.
Yes.
Okay.
The same
Okay.
construct that the homestead property tax
Yes.
currently has. It's
Yes.
just instead of raising this many dollars, it's raising this many dollars.
Yes.
But it's everything else.
And no
remains the same when
no
you
income
set the property
sensitivity.
tax credit.
Yes.
What?
No
income sensitivity. And the question is it possible to make that low enough that no income sensitivity is viable?
You're not gonna, it'll be interesting to
Yes,
see
and I don't know.
Really hard.
I know.
who's gonna get hit.
I think probably the answer is
And
no.
people that don't pay any income tax now will owe no property tax.
If they don't own a home.
No, if they don't own, I mean, we just up,
That's,
Or depends on which one.
yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
it looks like people up to about $40,000-$50,000 with all the credits and things we've given aren't, some of them, many of them maybe, we don't know yet, won't owe any income tax.
And that's something that's
policy.
so that's something that we can figure out next week. Because now we're done.
We're done.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Leader has
everyone.
spoken. And I'm going to